Hello and welcome back to yet another episode of the War Report. We have quite a bit to cover. Not too many topics, but pretty in depth about the topics that we do have to cover. Of course, updates on Ukraine, some news out of Europe, the current crisis in the Red Sea and the Middle East in general, and then getting into the situation with Pakistan and Iran and trying to make sense of that. I certainly have my thoughts, and I know you do
Mm.
as well as just a few other items peppered throughout the show. And it looks like we're in for a pretty standard fare, but hopefully something interesting will come out of this. I'm sure it will because it always does. So let us begin. And I imagine that you
Yep.
have quite the update for Ukraine on us, and I'm ready
Uh,
for your maps whenever.
okay. Yeah, I do. The two big stories are Krinky and Avdiivka on the front. Especially in the last 3 days, a lot of activity has been happening there. So I'm going to send you, I believe I showed you this map last week. And this was to highlight the advancement that the Russians had made, I believe, around the 12th of January. It might have been the 11th, but so that's that. And then about a little over 48 hours ago, well, this is Saturday night. It honestly might have been on Wednesday. We saw this. Um, so you can see that for all intents and purposes, Krinky has been captured by the Russians. Now, recall the articles that we cited by both Western and Ukrainian press, even the Russian ones, but we usually just, let the West and Kiev do the talking when we cite these things. That fighting there was very difficult, and I will stress that it was difficult for both sides. Nonetheless, there's a very interesting story about the inevitable fall of Krinky. The way it happened was that there were about 135 soldiers that came in for rotation. And one of the papers that I was reading earlier this week was describing how, getting there in of itself is very difficult because often their boats are destroyed. And what I noticed on Telegram channels of video footage of drone drops on these poor Ukrainian soldiers is that the river looks quite frozen. And what happened actually was once those 135 got there, they refused to serve. And because the river is frozen, they left. And now the Russians are basically in a process of a mopping up operation. They're going to look for those who have been left behind. We're talking a very small number. Of course, the maps I showed you basically the Russians really encircling this. People will have to go to older episodes back in November and October to see um, how much larger this space was.
And I'll also recommend because although it is Russian, some people may say biased or whatever. A good source if you want to look at a time lapse is Sputnik. You can do by date, and I know it
Mm,
doesn't go all the way back to the beginning, but I know it lets you go back several months if you just want to see the progress of the war. Like I said, take it with a
yes.
grain of salt as you would take any Ukrainian or Western source with a grain of salt. But it's good if you want to see a time lapse, see how things have progressed day by day, week by week.
Yes. So, as you can see in the map, I mean, the Dnieper, I have strong doubts that the Dnieper is completely frozen over, but definitely all the little riverlets, the creeks that feed in and out of the Dnieper are frozen. This made it, on the one hand, very difficult to get to Krinky and resupply it. On the other hand, it made it quite much easier to abandon Krinky and go into the forest and marsh areas of the islands adjacent to Krinky. So, I mean, in a way, the Ukrainians, I think part of the reason they did this was to pull away Russian troops. Of course, it was to attrit Russian troops as well, but it was to pull them away basically from Zaporozhye and Avdiivka, because I think, and to a lesser extent, Kupiansk. Um, Remember that a lot of the brigades that were trained exclusively by NATO, with no Soviet influence whatsoever in their upper reaches of command, like the 47th and the 33rd, were positioned in Avdiivka. So that's the situation in Krinky. Now we're going to go to Novomihailovka, where people recalled on the last show that the Russians were pushed down from the immediate southern part of Novomihailovka. And so I'm going to send you that map. And but subsequently, what they managed to do just a day later was take this farm field well to the south. And then a few days later, more this week, we have another advancement. My guess is, as you can see in the map, that now there are only 5 kilometers from the road, and that road would be used to resupply Krinky and the other towns like Konstantinovka, which is about the same size as Novomihailovka. So they're edging towards there and applying pressure. The Russians really have been applying pressure all for several months, but again, no sweeping advancements, no willingness to do that. And then a few days ago, we had news. Um, this is an area not far from Avdiivka. Honestly, it's just to the south of Avdiivka in Pervomayske. And Pervomayske, you see, the Russians have actually advanced further than this, but I couldn't find a map. But small advancements there. And maybe again, before we reach the situation in Bakhmut, I'll show you an area. Sorry, before we reach Avdiivka, I'll show you basically what's happening in the southern part of Bakhmut. There were some recent advancements there as well. Plus, there's an interesting story behind this. You can see in this map, immediately to the south of it is another area, and that's the heights above Klishayevka, which is a town just outside of Bakhmut. Basically, this is a very fortified area, and the fortifications are there facing Klishayevka. So if you attack from the north, it's a little easier than attacking from the south. For one, it's on higher ground than Klishayevka, and so the Russians have stopped trying to retake Klishayevka. They've normalized the situation south of the town, as you can see along the railroad tracks. So they're focusing on the northern part. This little gain is indicative of the kind of gains they've made all along this area since November and December. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to basically encircle Ivanivske, which is just outside of Bakhmut. But to do that, they need to secure the southern flank. And this is an area that I'm not sure if they ever controlled it, or they definitely, well, Wagner, I think, did control it at one time. And then the Russians fell back. And then this last one from Bakhmut is, oh, sorry, just disregard the one I sent you. It's the same one. I got mixed up. The only other bit of news before we get to Avdiivka is the Russians managed to capture a town, again, north of Bakhmut. Let's say it's basically, how Soledar is like northeast of Bakhmut. Veselye is northeast of Soledar. So there's also an important river around this area, and so the Russians have taken Veselye there. So now I'm going to focus on Avdiivka, and I'll send you the map of what Avdiivka was like last week, around the time that we did the show, and you can see in this map um, the the hotel of the Tsar, or the Tsarskaya Ochota. Um, Now the Russians have come close to this area. They've been pushed back. They've had more success to the northeast of that, as you can see on the map, right? Um, I'll show you this image as well. And then, because I've always wondered what this place actually looks like. So the Russians sent a missile into that hotel, which I'm honestly surprised they waited so long, because this probably has a well fortified basement and so on. And so once that happened, the Russians then began making advancements, and this is basically what occurred next. This is from yesterday, and you can see that they've begun pushing the Ukrainians out of this area. There are heavy trench networks in this area. If people recall, on the show that we did, I think it was back in October, probably the end of October. Just to give you another example, you can kind of see the networks here, the trench networks in satellite form. Not an easy place to navigate. Here's another image. So that is what they took yesterday, and then today they basically built up on that, and they've managed to capture this. And they're basically right next to the hotel that they bombed. So they've moved the whole southern flank, and it's notable. We should note that. Uh, Give me a second. In the meantime, why don't I show you like an overall map of basically the gains in and around, like maybe the northern part of Avdiivka, and just a bigger general picture of 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 the situation developing there. And I promise I will. There it is. So just so people understand, once they've looked at that, to return to the southern front, this is a topographical map which is showing how important it was to keep the southern part, because it's on the highest territory throughout Avdiivka. Everything else is like, kind of like a mid height, and then uh, lowlands as you press further. Of course, the city is on a medium height, um, and there's still some of the higher elevations to the left, to the east, sorry, to the west of recently captured territory. Um, so let me see if I have any more maps. That might be it. Oh, yes. And then some advancements in the north. This last one that I'm going to send you right now, this was interesting because there was a video that followed it. There was a column of 9, maybe 10 armored vehicles by the Russians. A Ukrainian drone was following them. And I think for the first time, I didn't see them getting hit. They didn't step on a mine. They weren't hit with artillery, no ATGM. And it was uncertain whether, like, did they capitalize? Did they manage to secure this area? So people have been waiting for about 48 hours to figure out if they have, and it looks like they did. So they've extended their zone of control. And then Scott from Calibrated did his own map that kind of gives you what he thinks is going to be the strategy for holding Avdiivka. And it's based on, the density of the urban area. You can see the gold orange highlighted area is where he thinks the Ukrainians will hold out the longest. They'll give up the southern part that you can see in the purple that the Russians have recently taken, including that little hook there that they managed to secure a few days ago. So, um, also notice that in this golden area, right at the bottom, there's a place that's called Kvartal. This Kvartal area is a lot of it's a lot of commie blocks, right? These are apartment buildings. Think of Bakhmut on a smaller scale. And it's one of the reasons the Russians have not been able to advance from the southwest because they have a very clear view. It's a lot like Ugledar as well. They're just not able to go undetected. But this other area, of course, to the south, it is much more difficult. There's forest there, there are trenches, and the Ukrainians would be much less willing to use artillery in this area in order to hold back the Russians because they would fear basically killing their own. However, that purple hook area that I told you, that's a very wide open area. There's no houses there. Um, a lot of the places that the Russians are encroaching, even in the north, are dakias. These are like small cottages, kind of bungalows, but made out of wood or something like that, right? These are modest homes, um, but not the urban areas quite yet. So that gives you an idea of what's happening in Avdiivka, and then just to round things out, the Russians are still pushing in Marinka. Small gains from a few days ago, but they've basically secured that town, and now I suppose I don't know. My guess is they'll have to go further west, but they would have to expand their zone of control both to the north and south because if it's a thin, small spearhead or salient, you risk being attacked from three sides, and that's not something you want. But that is all I'm going to say for the front lines. The other thing I'll mention is there have been attacks on Gorolovka by Ukrainians. One man was killed. Five people were injured. This is the town directly north of Donetsk, the city Donetsk. Um, but then, I mean, if you want, we could get into some pretty interesting stories that have been developing in Ukraine over the last week, and even more so.
Certainly. And I just wanted
Yeah.
to mention first just one last additional detail about the front. Well, tangentially related to the front, I should say. There were missile interceptions over Belgorod and Bryansk
Yes.
yesterday. Now, as far as I know, I haven't seen any video footage of these strikes actually landing, so we can take the claim at face value that all the missiles were intercepted, but you do see a continued attempt to strike into territory in Russia proper. And I think that will continue as the war goes on, as it gets more desperate, because that's really the last card the Ukrainians can play. They can hope that strikes on the bordering territories will demoralize the Russian war effort. Now, that comes with the high risk that it also galvanizes it, that it justifies the war in the eyes of the Russian people. So it becomes a very high risk, high reward prospect for the Ukrainians, even though
Hmm.
right now
Hmm.
it doesn't seem to be paying off whatsoever, especially going into the election in Russia, going into the mobilization of even more forces, and just Russian rhetoric over the past few weeks. It doesn't seem like we're looking at any sort of wavering on their part, any sort of negotiations on their part, which
Yeah.
we've been hearing rumors of for months now. The Russians are ready to negotiate. The Russians and the
Yeah.
Ukrainians are making
Yeah.
backdoor
Yeah.
deals. These things that get put out over and over with no substantiating evidence to them. So,
Yeah.
I mean, that's been happening since the beginning of the war, but it has increased, especially as prospects for Ukraine look far worse. You do see more reports of that, and I think it's quite obvious that they are interconnected events. But in terms of the political situation in Kiev, Zelensky's career, Zelensky's grasp on power, certainly he's not at no risk of being overthrown right this minute, but his grasp on power is slipping. His loss of international support once again continues to slip. And we'll get into it in a few minutes, but there has been a very interesting interview given by Arestovich to an English language media
Hmm.
outlet.
Yeah. Just to sort of finish up, these aren't necessarily, I mean, you could look at them as Frontline. But I'm going to send you, I sent you two photos, and that's what Krinky looks like before and after. Just to give you an idea of the devastation there. This reminds me of photos of Marinka, Andreevka, many towns look like this now in eastern Ukraine. But the next photo I'm going to show you is there was two attacks. Unfortunately, I don't have a map of the second one, but the first one was an attack using, I think, a drone. Um, yes, a UAV was shot down above an oil depot of some kind. No casualties, and the fire was of course put out. But they had another drone attack uh, just outside of St. Petersburg, another oil facility. So just to let you know about that, they're still attacking. But I think one of the really kind of interesting developments that have been happening um, in Ukraine, and this kind of leads us into European news, is the amount of attacks that the Russians have increased, particularly on the city of Kharkov. Now, there is a bit of a Gonzalo Lira sweet revenge part to this story. And if people recall, back at the end of December, it was probably on the show before Christmas, and I think it was before we had Geo on. Recall that I brought up that the Palace Hotel, I described it as having like a lower section and a tower section about 10, 12 stories high, might be higher than that. The Russians just annihilated that. And their claim was that there were mercs in there, right? And then when Geo was on, there was another hit, and I mentioned that this was on a kind of old-fashioned looking hotel, much smaller, only 2 or 3 stories high. And then really like this week, so over a week after we had Geo on, I believe on Tuesday there was yet another attack. But this one, the Russians claimed that 60 mostly French mercenaries were killed. Now, this caused Macron to speak up and say that there are no French mercenaries fighting in Ukraine. Those are French citizens. Well, like, it's, I mean, I think we all know by now that no Western government is going, even though in the first days of the war in 2022, no Western government is going to lock up anybody that went and fought against Russia, right? And in fact, the West is depending on well-trained mercenaries in the thousands fighting in Ukraine. They did so in 2014 and 15, and they do so now. So I thought that was interesting that he felt it necessary to mention this.
I
Uh,
thought Medvedev's response was also pretty funny,
yeah, to do tell, do tell.
where it was more or less along the lines. I can't remember the exact
Oh
wording,
yeah, the
and
gay
and
rights.
I hadn't saved it, but more or less criticizing the French for quote unquote walking into Russian missile strikes. Like, why were you there? What were you doing? Why did
Oh my God, he's brutal.
he?
Uh,
Yeah, it's.
so, so I think this is very interesting. It's caused the West to address this issue. Of course, I think you were talking about Zelensky. Uh, you know, if Zelensky's in power, it means that America still sees, and of course, I'm not saying all the elites agree on this, but they all essentially think that he has to remain in power. That it's, I mean, it's something that's kind of resolved. Um, there is less willingness to fund the war, but I think as the election is coming around the corner, um, what are we, 10, less than 10 months, nine some odd months,
Yeah,
and
just about.
that 1 or 2 months before election night, right? It's going to go crazy. Come September, it's going to be nuts. There are going to be all kinds of episodes and accusations, and maybe even a black swan event. Who knows, right? So I would say that they definitely want enough funding to keep the war going till November and a little bit thereafter. Um, the other thing that Macron mentioned is that he urged arms manufacturers to increase their production. He said they're falling behind and they have to do this. Um, to me, I also read that as a kind of like sunk ship fallacy, right? They've invested so much into this war that really the only way this could be beneficial for them is if they win, and you know, like essentially destroy Russia. So Podolyak gave an interview, and one of the things he said was, and this kind of reflects some of the things, echoes some of the things that Zelensky was saying at Davos, and that is, people talk about negotiations, but negotiations are only good when the other side is suffering, and we will only enter negotiations when Russia is suffering, and we're looking for cues such as civil unrest, right? Again, the bombing of Belgorod, and um, when the authorities can be turned over, like he's literally talking about a coup. Like when we think the potential for a coup in Russia is there, then we will enter negotiations, or the negotiations they themselves may act as a catalyst for a coup, right? Their Navalny dream. Navalny will be broke out of prison and he'll become the new president of one of the 10 different Russias. so, um, so I thought that was interesting. But what about you? What news do you have, either from Ukraine or Europe?
Well, I will say with Europe, we are starting to see a little bit more of a faltering now. By no means is Slovakia a power player within the European Union, don't get me wrong.
Mm,
But there has been a reversal of Ukraine policy by the new government, as was expected and as was promised. So, not only are they trying to do what they can to lift sanctions insofar as they can with what's set forth by the European Union, but also they lifted restrictions on quote unquote cultural exchange with both Russia and Belarus. And that was something that was large at the beginning of the war. That was something that was one of the first things to go. Anything tangentially related to Russia had to be silenced, had to be put away. I'm sure you all remember how ridiculous it got from February to March of 2022, where practically the word Russian itself was banned. It was beyond that, of course, the exaggerated but still somewhat true claims about the banning of the letter Z in some countries, where
banning of the Russian blue cat was one that I thought was
just
hilarious.
just
The
anything.
Balalaika, the Balalaika was banned in Sweden. Remember?
It's
Remember how insane it got?
yes, but we are seeing, at least in some parts of Europe, the rollback of some of that. Now, we'll see if Slovakia is faced with similar penalties as, say, Hungary is being right now. They're trying to strip Hungary of their voting rights within the European Union because the European Union requires a unanimous vote to pass not all, but most actions, and Hungary has been responsible for stonewalling many of the EU decisions, particularly when it comes to nuclear fuel. Them and conversely, the French have been stonewalling those decisions. Also, speaking of sanctions, we have the U.S. I can't remember whether we mentioned it last week, so I'll mention it again. The U.S. has opened up its ports to Russian oil imports once again, while still having
Mm.
it under sanction. And the main thing I wanted to get into regarding Ukraine was, once again, I just wanted to go over this interview with Arestovich with the media outlet Unheard. And I'm just going to read through it. I'll pause and interject with my thoughts, and certainly feel free to interrupt me if you have anything you want to comment or say about it. But unless you have
I'll
any.
say just I'll just say one thing
Okay.
because as long as we were talking about Slovakia, so Fitzko said um, regarding Hungary that if you take a, the EU needs all members to vote in favor of just taking away the vote from Hungary. We don't like Hungary, so we're just not going to allow Hungary to vote anymore. He said, as long as my government is in place, we will never agree to this. And then one of his cabinet members, Miroslav Radakovsky, said, quote, if you do not stop supplying weapons to Ukraine and killing Slavs, we Slavs will unite as brothers, and I believe we will unite and level Western Europe to the ground. I'm sure no one here wants that. This is the most base thing I've ever heard.
I truly think that pan-Slavism at this point is really only alive in Slovakia.
Yeah.
I don't know, just based on my following of European politics for the past 2 years, it does seem like Slovakia is really the only nation that still has these sentiments left, and I very much so admire them for that.
I love them. I love them.
It's
Yep.
they're definitely the best of the Western Slavs, that's for sure.
Hmm.
Not a very high bar, don't get me wrong, but yeah, that's it. They've proven to be entertaining, and honestly, like I said, they're not major power players in the European Union, neither the Hungarians, but especially as confidence wavers in Western European governments. Speaking of which, the EU sent its head clown Maloney to go negotiate with Kazakhstan for an energy deal, trying to circumvent their lack of energy as a result of the Russian sanctions. So we'll see how that plays out. They couldn't have sent anyone more competent. And maybe as part of the agreement, she'll sign off on bringing 500,000 Kazakhs back home with the energy. Because that seems to be the going rate. Of course, we need migrants to fund our pension plans, just ignore the absolute net drain they are on the budget. I mean, you think there's a lot of Kazakhs in Russia? Wait until you see Europe in 5 years with these energy agreements, with these economic agreements. They'll be all over the place. And like I said, I don't even say that like I'm not happy about that, but by no means. But who are we kidding ourselves? It's
Yeah.
that's where it's gonna go. I mean, I know we've mentioned it before, but honestly, Putin should give his Gaddafi speech. If I go, they come in.
Yeah.
Because you want to talk about the so-called Asiatic hordes of Russia. I mean, look, love or hate them, despite all their flaws, the Russians are the only ones holding them back. Like, you want to talk about the Central Asians, like, they're realistically the only ones keeping them in check right now, the Central Asians. Because, I
Yeah.
mean, if we want to talk pure demographics, we can get in birth rates. But once again, I'm going off on a tangent here. I want to get into this Arestovich article. But news out of Europe has lessened over the past few months because, once again, Europe's political relevance has effectively dissolved as part of this war. And it seems like no matter what the newest crisis is, they always come out on the losing end, whether it be Russia Ukraine, whether it be Israel Palestine, whether it be the current crisis in the Red Sea with the Houthis, which I suppose is an outgrowth of Israel Palestine, and any potential future conflict with China. Once again, they'll also come on the losing end of, due to European Chinese economic relations over the past few years. They've grown immensely. Of course, the largest trade deal in history was signed between the European Union and China in late 2020. But once again, I remember just a year and a half ago on the show when I could spend half an hour just talking about individual news stories out of Europe. But
Yeah.
their political relevance, and like I said, I don't even mean this to gloat over them, because I actually have a great deal of sympathy, especially for the average person living in Europe, with how much their standard of living, how much their economy, how much their global relevance has decreased. And once again, I don't see a realistic out for them. And there's really only so many times I can say that. In so many ways I can say that, but I feel like it's one of those things I find myself repeating over and over. And once again, it's one of those things worth repeating. And truthfully, I mean, it may be easy enough to say reconciliation with Russia, of course, after the Ukraine war ends on Russia's terms. Like speaking from like my perspective, or like trying to be an idealist about this, because once again, I would like to see, just for the sake of both parties and honestly for the sake of global stability, a strong relationship between continental Europe and Russia. I think that would be a benefit to everyone there and also a benefit to the world. But once again, that bridge has been effectively burned, and it will remain broken. Those links will remain broken so long as Washington continues down this path of, frankly, global destruction. And yeah, believe me, that's not the only area that's going to lose big. But I find myself coming back to this point again and again because I don't think people realize, honestly, how much of a losing position the Europeans are in right now.
Yes. The other interesting news out of Slovakia is they're banning LGBT
Oh, based.
propaganda. Yeah. Yeah, as long as you bring this up, there was this very interesting Newsweek article that was published on Friday.
Ah, yes, that one.
Yes, and you know, um, Russia has won the sanctions war. Words to that effect. And then it brought up GDP growth. And now it didn't want to say that Russia's economy grew by 3.5%, so they just said it grew over 3%. Recall that America's economy grew by only 2.4% in 2023. Germany's contracted, and the combined economy of the EU grew by 1%, right?
And that's also on top
Those,
of they've exceeded Saudi oil exports, reaching 7.5 million barrels a day. And not to mention,
yes,
this article goes in just a brief summary, and this actually comes from this brought to my attention by the Telegram channel Eurasia and Multipolarity, where they have worked through third-party countries such as Iran, Turkey, China, North Korea, Kyrgyzstan. You actually look at the trade figures between Germany and Kyrgyzstan, took a very odd spike in 2022 and 2023. But once again, Russia's using these middleman parties in order to trade with the outside world. And once again, the countries who have sanctioned Russia, the countries that have gone along with this, they've accomplished nothing but paying a premium for what they would have gotten before while the Russian economy thrives on it. So I mean, like I said, I have my thoughts on the sanctions packages. Certainly, they wanted to isolate Russia. That no doubt about that. But there
yeah,
were definitely some secondary effects. I imagine they fully anticipated that were baked into the cake there, and I do think that those were
yeah,
targeted particular towards Germany as punishment for their quote unquote insolence, especially when it came to Nord Stream 2, which exploded just out of nowhere. We have no explanation for
we'll
that
never know.
officially. It,
Thank you,
just
America. We'll
those
never know.
four what was it, Danish or Norwegian yachts,
Danish,
but
yes, yes, yes.
whatever or maybe it was the Ukrainians and the SBU. If we need to throw Zelensky under the bus, once again, the always shifting narrative that you notice at this point actually they never even accuse the Russians of self sabotage anymore. They ever that's been completely dropped. And nobody believes it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And Poland actually, it's been revealed that Poland does not want to participate in any further investigations. Weird. But one of the things that was cited in that Newsweek article was one of the methods. There were several. One was having friends, lots of resources, planning. But one of the reasons that was cited was gold. That Russia's vast amounts of gold. I found this interesting because on the 16th, it was published that they've in Russia they found the largest gold deposit since 1991, 100 confirmed tons of gold in Chukotka, uh, Sovinaye, Chukotka. This is that area that faces Alaska.
Wait, are you telling me that this whole time Putin has been a libertarian? But all jokes aside, the Russians have been investing in gold in years, even before the sanctions, even before
Yeah.
Crimea. That's actually been one of the main policies for the Putin government that has really paid off. Is they've been trying to get their hands on gold, trying to stop gold from leaving the country, whether that be deals with, I know Venezuela back when that was a crisis, back when the Venezuelan economy was really close to the brink of collapse. You recall 2019 when there were murmurs of regime change there. Russians bought up a bunch of gold and oil from there. And they have been pursuing this policy for a number of years now, and it has been paying off. And I'm not a gold standard purist. I think that you can have an economy without it, although I do think it certainly has its merits. But once again, we're seeing the value of not only gold as really the, for lack of a term, gold standard when it comes to backing of your currency, but also an abundance of natural resources. They talked about in this article Russian diamond exports, largest producer and exporter, nickel, copper, oil, natural gas, all of that. Russia is a it's full. It's chock full of every natural resource you could imagine, which has made them such a valuable partner. Which is why their global relevance will continue so long as they are a single unified state. And I know that there are forces who want to break them apart. I know there are forces who try to exaggerate that. Well, Siberia is going to be Chinese in 20 years, is what they were saying 20 years ago. That still has yet to happen, or a number of these things. But so long as Russia can remain a unified state, it is in many ways a kingmaker of the world economy with the amount of resources it has. And not to put off this article for too much longer, this Arestovich article, that's why I do find these claims that Russia is going to be eclipsed by China or eclipsed by whoever else a bit ridiculous. Sure, the Chinese are an economic powerhouse. I don't think anyone can deny that. But when it comes to resources, when it comes to what you actually need to run an economy, run an industrial society, Russia has all of that, and they're the ones who can divvy that out. And they also are a nuclear power. They have the force to project. And as shown by this, you can say what you will about the early war effort, but it's a country that's proven that it's able to fight a an industrial war, a modern conventional war as well. So for decades to come, I think this country, barring any sort of major political crisis or collapse, has proven itself as a power player in the world that is frankly here to stay. Now, that's not saying it's going to be without issues. That's not going to say it's even going to be a golden age or renaissance. I think particularly post-war with a lot of things they have to cope with, they are in for some very difficult times. I think those times can be weathered, but I don't think it's going to be exactly a post-war boom as some people might expect.
Yeah.
Uh, but once again, certainly, in terms of all of the major powers, even compared to China, I think I do really think that compared to U.S., China, the European Union, so far as they're still a power bloc, India even, that the Russians do have a certain edge when it comes to longevity, when it comes to being able to weather the upcoming crises in the next decades.
Hmm. Hmm.
But with all that being said, I will get into this article. Once again, stop me and interrupt me at any point if you have
Yep.
any thoughts on this, because I'm sure you'll have plenty. I'll have plenty, certainly. So, the article begins. At the start of the war in Ukraine, Alexei Arestovich, one of the many anglicizations I've seen of his name, has was the spokesman for President Zelensky, too wise by the way, and one of the most recognizable faces on Ukrainian TV. His nightly briefings on the status of the war earned him the nickname Therapist in Chief, and at one point his approval ratings were second only to the president. Since then, he has become a fierce critic of the Zelensky administration and has left the country to avoid multiple prosecutions. Now he plans to run for president against Zelensky at the next election. In his first Western media interview since his fallout with the government, he spoke from the United States to Freddie Sayers. This is an edited transcript. The English has been improved for readability. So it begins. Sayers, the interviewer, starts. In the past 18 months, you've turned from being President Zelensky's spokesman to one of his fiercest critics. What changed? Arestovich responds. I'm not so much a critic of President Zelensky himself. I criticize the Ukrainian system, a corrupt system which, if it doesn't change, means we can't win this war. I'm not in a personal war with President Zelensky. I'm criticizing the system and his politics. Sayers asks, did you have more confidence in the system when you were speaking for the Zelensky government? Arestovich responds, I was a spokesperson of the office of the president, not the government. But yes, the main motivation for me when the war started was to hold our people together, not to be afraid of this invasion, and to hold strong for victory. That is still my motivation, but I'm a military professional and I've fought more than 2 years in this war. I understand what we have to do to win this war. You have to look at what Mr. Putin is doing right now. There are four principal strategic decisions he has made over the past year and a half, which has given him superiority over the Ukrainian position. First of all, he managed to frame this war from a he managed to frame this war from a Russian-Ukrainian war into a war between the global South and global West. We have seen how BRICS organizations have multiplied, and Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Iran, and other countries are coming together in this so-called quote-unquote anti-Western bloc. This change of frame gives them diplomatic and political abilities they didn't have at the beginning of the war, when the whole world condemned this invasion. Second, Putin managed to avoid a lot of the sanctions because of this change in frame, which has thirdly enabled him to multiply the production of military industry. We used to speak about how Russia would have insufficient means to produce the cruise missiles which they used to strike Ukraine, but they've since managed to produce them. They have a system of avoiding sanctions which works very well. The fourth strategic decision was to motivate the Russian people to get involved in the war. 14,000 Russian recruits arrive every month to recruiting centers, and Putin now does not need conscription. This is completely different from the Ukrainian situation. We're trying to recruit 500,000 personnel, but we face serious problems in terms of motivation. Back to Sayers, he says, do you believe that those four things mean that Russia and Putin are in a different position now than when you were working for Zelensky? Arestovich responds, absolutely. They are now in a much better position than when the war started. They've changed their group of allies, building links using an anti-colonial narrative to the global south. This has been very successful for us, for me, for Ukraine, which is why I criticize Mr. Zelensky's policy in our system. Mostly it is on these last 2 points, the motivation for our people to fight and the military industrial production. We obviously cannot compare to Russia because it's a huge country with a lot of resources, but we're not doing what we can. And then back to Sayers. What happens if there are no changes in the system, as you call it? Do you think Russia will make further territorial gains inside Ukraine? Arestovich. I don't think the most dangerous thing is losing more territory. The most dangerous thing is losing Western support. Right now, the United States is too deeply involved in the Ukrainian military and financial decisions. This is a very, very dangerous and non-stable position because Americans, both Democrats and Republicans, have big ideological conflicts about the Ukrainian question, which is linked to the coming presidential election. The question of Ukrainian assistance is very fragile. Back to Sayers. What happens to Ukraine if American support falls away, either through a change of administration or because the current administration loses enthusiasm? Arestovich, the stopping of financial aid would mean the loss of macroeconomic stability, which would endanger social payments and pensions and the provisions of social aid for our people. We have insufficient gold and currency deposits in our national bank. There again with the gold. We
Hmm.
could face massive inflation, and the front line would mean and on the front line, it would mean we start to lose territory because Russians still have superiority in artillery shells, rockets, personnel, armored tanks, etc. We would face two forces against the building of the Ukrainian state, the interior problems and the Russian aggression. This is a very dangerous situation. Back to Sayer. So you think that it is a twin threat, then internal fragility and maybe economic turmoil, and people not getting the support payments leading to eventual territorial loss as well? Arestovich. Absolutely. And if we're thinking politically, it means the legacy of legitimacy of Zelensky and his political party will start to come into doubt. It is another dangerous step because in a war, the government has to make unpopular decisions such as conscription, financial cuts, so on, and it is possible when you have great and it is possible when you have great legitimacy, but if you have low legitimacy, it is very difficult to execute even popular decisions. Sayers, at some point, the level of financial support that is being provided to Ukraine cannot go on forever. I think that most people would agree with that. So, what is your long term solution instead of just trying to get the Americans to extend their support and extend it again? What what does a good long term settlement look like? Arestovich, for me, one of the main mistakes of Zelensky was to appeal to the West using an emotional argument. We have to change the policy. We have to place a calculator between us and the collective West and start to think. What are the real profit calculations? For the United States, it's mostly the titanium industry and the lithium industry, which they were very interested in within Ukraine. but I see nothing of that. Once again, large reason for the Maidan right there. The although Ukraine is nowhere as resource rich as Russia, it is still
But
very
the
resource
lithium is a
rich.
big deal for them.
Absolutely. And
And also, what is it, the other thing that they used to be like the second highest producer of it's used for making semiconductors. Remember we were talking
um,
about it? And,
what I know what you're trying. Is that silicon? No, I don't think it is.
no, it was something else that spun and then the discs are cut into it.
I can't remember off the top of my head, but
Neon or anyways,
I
somebody in the chat
yeah
will know, but
I know what you're trying to get at. Not to mention major iron producer, and before the war, and in fact before the fall of the Soviet Union as well, major steel industry in Ukraine. That's what Avdiivka
yeah,
was. That was what all of that was.
yeah.
So Arestovich continues. We have to start. We have to start being interesting to the West, not just in terms of values and ideas and democracy, but material profit. What could the West gain from a partnership with Ukraine and the West? I mean, industry. I mean, agriculture. We have to calculate what we could do to make a real profit from the collective West. While he does have a point there, just personal interjection aside, almost every resource Ukraine has, Russia has, and also has more of. Now, there is the argument that you don't want to be in a codependence with Russia, or you don't want to be too reliant on Russia, so Ukraine is a good counterbalance to that. But once again, when it comes to the cost of the tunes of billions, which, I mean, to his credit, I suppose, Arestovich has addressed that. It, I mean, there are some interesting considerations here, and depending on how much of a leverage you want. But once again, I think that's probably the most coherent point anyone's ever made about support for Ukraine. Not that I'm going to co-sign it or anything, but still.
He makes good arguments. He's capable of doing that. He has a very persuasive quality about him if you give him the chance, right? And these are important salient points that people rarely discuss. However, I will say this: his ultimate argument is this is how Ukraine can be beneficial to the West, to its funders, particularly the US, right? Because they're the biggest funder. However, look at what is happening on the ground. European countries are still blockading. Forget Russia. European countries are blockading Ukrainian agricultural products.
Oh, it would destroy the economy of the frontier countries,
Yes.
Poland especially. And Poland has been a stalwart supporter of Ukraine, to say the
How many
least.
months is this blockade has been going on for over 5 months?
Oh,
It,
absolutely. And we go back to, I believe it was March or April, you had the contaminated grain storages that went to Poland and Slovakia as well as other places within the European
yeah.
Union where it certainly did not meet European Union standards. And so, in many ways, while he does make that point, it also does present fierce competition to, once again, the poorer nations of the European Union, the ones that you really need to convince to stay to keep them under wraps. And, I mean, because at what point are you going to convince, say, Bulgaria to go along with this, except
Mhm.
the billions in euros that they get from Brussels every year?
Yeah,
But
think of the protests in Germany by the farmers, as we saw the year before or the earlier part of the year in the Netherlands, right? I mean, they're basically prepping these farmers. They're trying to drive them out of business, kind of in preparation of getting even cheaper agricultural products from Ukraine. I mean, that's what I think is going on,
I would certainly agree that among
either from Ukraine or from the US, but
certainly,
that's what they're
and
doing.
I think at this point they're trying to pillage everything out of Ukraine they can while they still can before we see an eventual Russian victory, barring World War III. But yes, it once again is making Europe more reliant on Washington one way or another, whether that be through proxy by Ukrainian goods and services and Ukrainian products, or whether that be directly from America. So once again, that's while I see the game that Arestovich is trying to play here, and of course he's not going to mention this because it runs counter to his narrative, and it's not like he's going to sit here and pick apart his own arguments in the middle of an interview. That's also something else we have to look at with this. But to continue on, once again, still Aristovich's words right here. It's not only the West, but there are states in Eastern Europe like Poland, the Czech Republic, and Romania. Beautiful that he doesn't consider them part of the West, because I mean, yes, realistically they're not. But you ask the people there, you ask the leadership there, they would try to ingratiate themselves with the West. But I find it kind of funny that he just
Hmm.
excludes them from the West as a category, which completely understand what Russian invasion means. They have the same history and the same understanding as Ukraine. Also, what is else is beautiful in that statement is he leaves out Hungary as well,
Yeah.
and Slovakia, for a matter of fact. We don't cooperate enough in terms of production and military equipment with these near neighbors. We have a customs conflict with Poland over grain, which we have made lots of mistakes, problematizing our partnership with our nearest neighbors. So a policy of emotions has to be changed to a policy of mutual profit and good sense. Sayers says, let's turn to the internal Ukrainian politics. You mentioned the mobilization or conscription. The question of where fighters are going to come from, how many more troops are needed, and where are they going to come from? Arestovich. On troops, the problem is our organization. When I was in office, I heard them say 4.5 million men, around half the whole fighting male age population in Ukraine, has avoided registering at the recruitment center, not for recruitment purposes, but to check their personal data. This is proof that the way we motivate our people for war is not successful. Now we are trying to recruit 500,000 troops using a mostly repressive campaign, not positive motivation. I was one of the public figures who started to ring the bell on this question. We have to present a positive motivation to take arms. You'll recall the interview with Arestovich, not Zelensky. I read a few
Hmm.
weeks back that he gave talking about the proper motivation for these forces, and that you can't just throw them in the back of a van and force them to fight. So he continues saying, we should talk about our principle. It has to be man-centric, human-centric. The recruitment has been about how to one person can change his fate by getting into the war. He has to be well recruited, well selected, well trained, well used on the front line because our army, in a lot of aspects, is still an old Soviet army, which thinks about personnel as the Russians do. People go forward and die. Quite the projection given the current state of this war and casualty
Yeah.
numbers and tactics. But once again, we all know what he's trying to do here, the narrative that he's trying to paint, which
Yes. Yeah.
I would say, yeah, in term just narratively speaking, he's doing a good job. But for us, it's a completely unsuitable approach because we have a lot less people than Russia. The person who gets in the army has to understand that he will be selected, trained, and used in the most profitable way, and his family will be completely defended from problems if he dies or is missing in action or is wounded. Sayers. So you think that if incoming recruits felt more confident that they would be used efficiently and that they felt military leadership was more competent, and also that there were great advantages, including increase in money for families in case of difficulty, recruitment would be higher? Arestovich, absolutely. Every Ukrainian has relatives in the armed forces, so they completely understand what's going on. Sayers, one thing which Ukrainians watching back home may ask is, why are you not on the front lines? You're in America right now. They might say, it's all very well for him to encourage people to go and fight, but he's not. Arestovich, I have some criminal investigations against me in Ukraine. In one of my this was the part that I sent you the article for. This is probably the best part of this article, and probably the most Arestovich story I can think of. In
Oh,
one
I
of my
love it.
seminars in which I was conducting from an online school, first of all, I didn't even know he had an online school until I read this, but it makes perfect sense given the man. When I was talking about men and women's relationship, I imitated the actions of stupid men who do not like women, and Ina Sovson, the MP who you had on this channel before, reported me to the National Police for criminal investigation by cutting out one sentence. I made this seminar to claim that, quote, Arestovich is completely against women. For further details on the controversy, see related report, which I will also link. After that, they
Can
collected.
sorry, can you please repeat that part where he was his accusation a few sentences prior to where you are right now?
Um,
I just have to hear it.
yeah, I'll go back. So, and Ina Sovsun, the MP who you had criticized before on this channel, reported me to the National Police for criminal investigation by cutting out one sentence I'd made in the seminar to claim that, quote, Arestovich is completely against women, unquote. After they collected 29 members of parliament to say that Arestovich has been arrested immediately when he returns to Ukraine, and that that our security council says that Arestovich is a Russian spy to be arrested by the Security Service of Ukraine, the
Everybody's a Russian spy.
SBU, of course.
He didn't.
When
What did he say?
when
What
he
did he
returns to
say? He's
Ukraine,
against women.
I think it is a completely political persecution here. Let me. I'm pretty sure I sent that to you, but uh, he was like doing an imitation of a wife beater. Yeah,
No,
yeah,
you're
that's
kidding.
yeah, that's more or less what it was in this life coaching seminar that he was giving.
So he had a life. He's like Gonzalo Lira.
Except with the foresight to escape the country when things get hairy.
Oh my God, ouch. So he had an online, I had no idea.
I
This
know
is news
I
to me.
did not know about this until I had read into this as well. And like I said, it's completely fitting that he would try to do some sort of like seminar for some online school. Um, so let me get the exact statement here. I think it is an article that it had linked here. So Ukraine launched an investigation about Alexei Arestovich over statement about choking women. um,
Joking.
okay, so here's the exact quote that Zelensky Arestovich was saying in context about his seminar. Tell me now what you usually want to do with these creatures: strangle them and strangle them without letting go. Now, mind you, YouTube and everyone listening, this is me quoting a quote. At first, of course, you want to F them, and then when you're fed up or used to her and got everything you want to strangle the F out of them. Just strangle her so she'd never exist, and after that, you don't open your fingers for 3 years until you're guaranteed that you had strangled her, while they're nagging, perpetual anxiety, and their attempts to control and attempts at castrating you and not letting you go and so on. Here's a question: why can't you strangle them? Well, we'll go to jail, but the pleasure we'll get, think about it. We're talking about long-term
Oh
pleasure.
my
That that
God.
is that is his quote, completely in context from the seminar where he's teaching young men not to engage in wife beating and wife strangling. I like how they need a class for that in Ukraine. Very fitting.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I remember making a similar joke at work a month ago. One of the girls says, um, why do men go to the front, Quran?" And I go, because beating up your wife or girlfriend gets boring eventually. She died laughing. She knows I'm not serious, obviously, right?
No, no, it's just
This
in the
is oh
Slav blood.
wow,
Yeah, it's
wow, yeah. Eventually there's going to be a Richard Spencer Twitter space with Arestovich. It has to happen.
yeah, oh, absolutely. That's
Can you imagine those two competing for most intelligent man in the room?
yeah, and they'll start a discussion on opposite sides, and then they'll talk completely past each other and end up at each other's positions anyway.
Yeah.
But but that aside, and that very interesting context to Aristovich's comments on uh, why not to choke your wife. Once again, I'm glad he intervened before I did anything I was going to regret. I need to clip that. I need to screenshot that. I need to post that everywhere. Somebody remind me to do that. But getting back to Sayer, this article has provided so much more entertainment than I
Yep.
would have even thought possible. Just to be clear, to those people who say you have connections to Russia or that you are in some way sympathetic to the Russian side, you have no contact inside the Russian Federation, he asks. Arestovich, no, only members of the Russian opposition here in the West. I'm not a Russian sympathizer. I just want Ukraine to be a European nation with a European army. When I was in office, I was the first person who had said there should not be any torture for Russian prisoners of war. We have to fight a European type war if we have a European nation and a European army. A lot of people who felt emotional trauma from the war, and some politicians in Ukraine who tried to create a policy of hate and emotional trauma from the war, tried to say Arestovich is pro-Russian, which is completely stupid. I fought the Russians for more than 2 years on the front line. Could you imagine a Russian spy who would fight against Russian troops on the front line? It is difficult for me. I want to be back in my country with my people, but I can't come back to Ukraine because of this. They have two criminal investigations against me right now. Sayer, you made the specific criticism of Zelensky's war strategy. For example, too much was invested in the defense of Bakhmut. Do you think retaking Crimea should be a goal for the Ukrainian government? It is a more profitable goal than liberating Donbass. Donbass is close to Russian regions, this is Arestovich speaking once again. It has been 10 years under Russian occupation, and there's an entire generation which has never lived in Ukraine. I mean, once again, you could say all that about Crimea as well, but
Mm.
it's like a nation in Great Britain, such as Northern Ireland. For Crimea, it is a question of our stability in the Black Sea region. It is a question of import and export, which is very important to the Ukrainian economy. So Crimea could be and may be a goal of the conflict, not Crimea itself, but stability in the Black Sea region, which Russians try to dominate, seeking to cut off our export and import supply lines. I mean, clearly, Arestovich has to know better than this. I think he does, but
I mean,
we all know the narrative.
Donbass was given to Ukraine much earlier in the 20s compared to Crimea, which was given to them in the 50s.
Oh,
So
absolutely. And
the 30-year difference.
like I said, I think we all know the narrative he's trying to construct here, but
Yeah,
he
yeah.
has to know
He's
better.
clever. He's
Yeah,
clever.
he is. And Sayer asks, "Are you suggesting that it would be okay to see the Donbass to Russia?" Arestovich, I think if we get into realistic policy, we have to say there's no way to liberate Donbass. Maybe in 5 or 10 years, even in Crimea, it could be possible. But the only goal we can have right now is not to give Russia more territory inside Ukraine and to force Russia into to give up this military way of dealing with Ukraine. My main idea is that we don't need Russian-Ukrainian negotiations. We need negotiation with all of Eastern European security. It could be multiple negotiations. We need to make a new system of security in Europe because the Potsdam-Yalta so-called system, which was created in 1945, does not work at all. Sayer asks, so you would not support negotiations between Ukraine and Russia? Arestovich continues, it's absolutely impossible. It's very stupid to speak out about this negotiation. We have to negotiate for an all-new security system for Europe. Taking into account all sides of the problem, Russia does not feel itself to be secure. We can laugh about this and we can say that we've never had an aggressive approach towards Russia, but if the Russians think so, and they are ready to kill for the security question, so we need a huge negotiation with both sides, all NATO members, all EU neighbors, all natural states that are interested in the security system of Europe to create a new so-called Potsdam-Yalta system, because the alternate will be 10 or 15 more years of war. Now, a few rhetorical differences aside, that's almost identical to what Orban said about the question of
Hmm.
European security. So, I do think that is, for anyone who is being completely honest with themselves, that is the approach that is need to be taken forward in Europe. That there needs to be a new security infrastructure that doesn't isolate the Russians, that takes their needs into consideration, but is still a there's still some teeth to show against them, at least in their words, not mine. But once again, I do think it's interesting that you get such different figures from Orban to Arestovich saying
Yeah,
such
I mean,
things.
even Putin suggested the same thing
Yeah, and I mean that was the
in the preamble to the war. The end of December, January, part of February. I mean, for 6 to 7 weeks, that's what he was saying.
and that was the premise of the early peace negotiations as well.
Yes, yes.
You go back, you read the Minsk III agreement, I suppose for convenience we can call it. That is more or less what was proposed, and that's what fell through. So once again, it does seem like a lot of these claims go back to, and he'll actually talk about the peace negotiations here, which I think is the more one of the more interesting parts of this article.
Hmm.
But he continues, I think NATO has discussed with Russia and Belarus what I love that he calls it Belarus, but what it would take to guarantee not to use military force in Europe to decide political questions and to create a new system on our political equations that avoids military power being wielded in the center of Europe. I should perhaps add that I am absolutely pessimistic that this will happen. I think we face 10 or 15 years of war in Europe because the opposition we have right now is very huge and cannot be decided by negotiations. But for me, but for my conscience, I have to be a person who talked about the idea openly. So when I'm older, at the end of my life, I could say I was the person who provided the idea of a new system for collective security in Europe instead of 10 more years of war. Sayers, this idea you want to be remembered for is what exactly? Is it specifically Eastern European treaty of some kind involving Poland, the Baltic countries, and all the countries that border Russia? Arestovich, it has to be all actors: Great Britain, Germany, France, the United States, all NATO and EU members and UN members, and then Russia, China, and Iran. The so-called axis of evil must be involved. What we really need is a new system of collective defense of the world, but at least in Eastern Europe. But I don't think we have the political vision, the political ability to make that system right now. I think we face a war, and Ukraine will not be the only country to fall in this war in the next 10 years. Uh, Interesting statement that he does expect the war to
Hmm.
expand. I wonder under which context, like if He's
Well, I can we can get into that because of some things that have been developing in Estonia and some remarks that have been coming out of Germany. But
oh certainly, yeah, yeah, we can get into that after this, but I'm curious, and once again, we all know what he's trying to do here, and the narrative he's trying to paint here. Whether he realistically, in his heart of heart, believes that it's going to be a Russian expansion of the war, or the Western expansion of the war. I couldn't tell you which he's actually getting at. So Sayers continues. Do you think that bilateral negotiations between Ukraine and Russia could have worked earlier in the process? There's been a lot of discussion around those early months when negotiations were in Istanbul. Arestovich. Yeah, I always remember the Istanbul process and it was the most profitable agreement we could have done. They concluded two previous agreements that were extremely dangerous for Ukraine, Minsk I and Minsk II. This agreement even contained the question of Crimea. It took 10 years of discussion, 15 years of discussion on the status of Crimea, and it meant security for the Black Sea. But now I don't know, because mid agreement in Istanbul, we came to Kiev. Interesting thing about this article, it's actually spelling Kiev the proper way the entire time.
mhm.
And after Buka, we heard from the president that we had stopped the negotiations. The next meeting was to be on the 9th of April, and on the 2nd of April it was declined. Sayer, so he came back from Istanbul thinking that the negotiations had been successful. Arestovich, yes, we completely opened the champagne bottle. We had discussed demilitarization, denazification, issues concerning the Russian language, Russian church, and much else. And in this month, it was the question of the amount of Ukrainian armed forces in peacetime, and President Zelensky said, quote, I could decide this question indirectly with Mr. Putin, end quote. The Istanbul agreements were a protocol of intention that was 90% prepared directly for the meeting with Putin. It was to be the next step in negotiation. Sayers, what is the sequence now, and how did Bucha derail the process? Arestovich, I did not really know. The president was shocked about Bucha. All of us were shocked about Bucha. I was in Bucha on the second day when the Russian forces repelled. Zelensky completely changed his face when it came to Bucha and saw what happened. A lot of people say that was Boris Johnson came to Kiev and put a stop to this negotiation with Russia. I don't know exactly if this is true or false, but he came to Kiev and nobody knows what they spoke about, except I think it's Zelensky and Boris Johnson himself. I think it was the 2nd of April. I was in Bucha the next day. The president had gone one day later, so it could have been the 4th of April, and the next meeting was to be on the 9th of April. So something happened in those 5 days, but members of the negotiation group stopped any negotiations. When we were asked how it could be restarted, the president said somewhere, sometime, but not now. Sayer, so something changed Zelensky's mind? Arestovich, yes, absolutely, and historians will have to find the answer to what happened. Sayer, but you think Russia was even sincere? Would they have even stuck to this negotiated settlement? Arestovich, the Russians showed their readiness to continuing negotiations and we declined. But now, after 2 years, I think it would be unreal to make an agreement at this time. Putin has changed this Russian Ukrainian war into an anti colonial war. The global south against the global west, and the systemic oppression of the west and the south is so huge. It includes the question of Israel Palestine, the question of Taiwan. It could not be solved by an agreement between Ukraine and Russia. It needs to take place at a much higher level. Once again, getting back to, I think this connection
Interesting
that
point.
people are seeing that these conflicts are metastasizing into one broader conflict with many fronts. And I think that was pretty clear after Israel Palestine happened and how we saw the reaction from Europe, from Russia, from China on that. But certainly an interesting point. The first time I really heard any major figure address that who isn't in our circles. So Sayer says, do you see it as a world war? Arestovich, I think it's a world war. It looks to me like a 30 years war in the 17th century. For me, the modern age started in this time. So for me, philosophically speaking, at the end of the modern era started the 30 years war. It will take another 30 years war to end it. Sayer, what do you mean by it being the end of the modern era? Arestovich, the modern period of development is ending. What is modernity? For me, modernity is a huge factor. It gets to all the systems like education, healthcare, military, industry, or like the market, like huge factors, like huge factories. But there are new and scientific and technical achievements like AI, things that like which are starting to blow up. This isn't just me stumbling. This is me reading word for word, by the way.
Mhm.
This factory conception. The science suggests that there is no way to standardize the world itself because the world is too various. It is once again interesting that he brings up the 30 Years' War and the
Mhm.
Westphalian system because I've seen people in our circles make that point. But once again, this is the first major figure, insofar as you want to consider Aristovich a major figure, who has made this point as well. So Sayer says, You're saying that the project of standardizing the world, making everyone similar, is coming to an end? Wow, Arestovich believes in multipolarity. Who would have thought? Arestovich, yes, is coming to an end. The world is much more various than standard. And what is the main tension from the global south to the global west? You can't standardize us. We are completely different from you. We are asking for the right to be different. Some traditions are not for us, and we are ready to go to war, even ready to fight you to have the right to be different. Sayer, so you see, as people defending their cultures being different from each other, Aristotelian culture is the way of making policy, the way of doing any human practice, the potential for another modus vivendi, another modus operandi, and they are ready for open war to achieve this. And we're almost at the end of this, by the way, just so everyone knows. So
I'm
this,
enjoying it.
yeah, yeah,
I read this part too,
yeah,
but yeah, go ahead. I
I
mean, rather, I watched the video of the interview.
yes, and this is where it gets a bit funny once again. So Sayer says this reminds me a little bit of someone I know who you were interested in the past, Alexander Dugin. I know that you attended a conference with him in the day you were associated with the Bravazzo far right party. Dugin has this big idea about Eurasia and wars of civilization. Do you have sympathy for his worldview? Arestovich, I never had sympathy with Dugin because I was an officer to military intelligence in Ukraine doing my military duty in Moscow. I was sitting with Dugin in one conference, but I have my own philosophical background, and we can see on the front line right now some cultures, Russian political culture, China political culture, Syrian, Iranian, is completely against the way we do policy in the last 300 years. This is a problem that we can see now in material ways, in the missiles which are landing on the heads of Russian and Ukrainian children. Once again, interesting that he mentions that yeah, civilians in both sides of this conflict have
Hmm.
been caught up rather than just the orc rhetoric you've been hearing. This is the main sign, not what Dugan says. Sayer, you believe that cultures like Russia, like Iran, are so different from the West that they are now prepared to fight for their differences. Arestovich, they are starting to fight against the system which has been established in the world for the previous 300 years. First of all, in the so called Westphalian Peace Agreement, and they are fighting against the main principle of the system. Sayer, what about Ukraine in this new world order? Does it belong with the West or does it belong with a non Western group? Arestovich, my main idea is that Ukraine could still find itself. The main question is what we're living and dying for, and Ukraine as a society and culture has a huge number of answers to this question. We're completely different. The main problem in Ukraine is that some politicians starting in 1991 wanted to transform Ukraine from a polycultural and polynational state into a more mono-ethnic and monocultural country, like most European countries such as Poland. But this means the loss of territory, but it means the lost territory that is completely different. Russian speaking territory, for example, in the east of Ukraine, south of Ukraine, a lot of Ukrainians, these 4.5 million Ukrainians who didn't want to be recruited by the state, they didn't want to be recruited for this political idea. It is not a problem of social construct of good pensions for retired military security or anything. It is a question of the future of Ukraine. I think a lot of Ukrainians do not want to be part of a project of the mono nation. Once again, fascinating point that I've never
Hmm.
heard anyone
Hmm.
on a high level make that Ukraine, yes, is it was a multi-ethnic state. It was a, for lack of a better term, multicultural state of primarily Ukrainians in the west and Russians in the east. And he's outright saying that the reason we've had so much problem with conscription is because we have tried the Ukrainianization of the east of the country. That these Russian-speaking Ukrainians, that these quote-unquote Russian Ukrainians are just as much part of our nation, and that. And look, I know everyone here has their thoughts about multi-ethnic states, multicultural states, which once again are certainly good points on that. But he's also making a point that given the history of this nation, given the way its borders were drawn, that in a way it does have to be a bilingual and bicultural country, and that's just a reality of the situation. And he'll continue on with this point because Sarah asked, "Do you think Ukraine should be one nation?" And Arestovich says, "No, I think Ukraine should be one political nation, but polyethnic and polycultural. Because if we want to hold Ukraine in its 1991 border, even officially, we have 58 nationalities here in Ukraine. Unofficially, there's more than 100. A lot of languages, a lot of different cultures, a lot of different histories of the region. Ukraine as a state was formed from parts of Great Empire, the Austro-Hungarian, the German, the Polish, the Russian, and we have absolutely different traditions. You can imagine because for Great Britain it is easy to understand, like Wales, Scotland, Ireland." And Arestovich, Sayer asks Arestovich, "Do you think it should be more of a federation?" Arestovich responds, "I don't know exactly how it should be formed politically or legally, But in fact, in a philosophical way, we are a federation because the south of Ukraine is completely different from the north of Ukraine, the east of Ukraine is completely different from the west of Ukraine, and even neighboring regions of Ukraine have different wedding traditions, etc. Sayer, so why should it be one country in that case? Arestovich, this is the question. Now, we practically can't answer that question when we see the problem of recruitment, the problem of mobilization, throws lights on all these very deep philosophical and historical problems. People are not refusing to join the army because of dangers of wounds or death, but because they do not understand the answer to this question. Why do we have to be one country? Why do we have to be one state? For what reason do we need a Ukrainian state? A lot of them say Ukrainian state gives them the ability to get say the Ukrainian state gives me the ability to get out the Ukrainian passport and get into Europe or another country. This is the main superiority of Putin. Russian recruits know for what they fight. They fight for Great Russia. These are all questions that we've asked on this program, even
Yep.
before the beginning of this war.
Yep.
Uh, why does Ukraine need to be one state? What is holding this political entity together? Is this just a border drawn by ethnic gerrymandering in the 1950s Soviet Union? I mean, the answer is yes to all of those, but Arestovich, somebody who needs to justify the existence of Ukraine, says that there needs to be more concrete answers to these questions. But the first pro Ukraine person I've actually ever heard address any of these points.
Mhm.
Because, once again, you're either dealing with the hardline Galician nationalists, and we all know the types, or you're dealing with the parrots in the West, or the people who just want to see the conflict continue because they want to get one over on Russia. But Arestovich is the first pro-Ukrainian I've actually heard even mention this. And I mean, so credit where credit is due. But I think the problem he runs into is there's no satisfactory answer for the Ukrainian side to any of these questions.
Yes. He has always been kind of, I would say, ever since that missile, that S-300 missile that went astray in Dnieper and hit the apartment complex. Remember that the Ukrainians, any missile that falls anywhere on any city in Ukraine is a Russian missile, right? And this happened after the incident in Poland, the Ukrainian missile that killed one or two farmers. I even think back then he mentioned that was probably a Ukrainian missile and not a Russian one. When the Dnieper incident happened, and there were far more fatalities, civilian fatalities, um, that's basically when he lost his job. Zelensky was furious. I mean, I think if you always have to take Arestovich with a pinch of salt, but I think his main point has always been that the only way Ukraine could have worked is the way Russia works, where politically it's one country with various different nationalities. There's one dominant one. Now, um, you know, Putin went to the edge on that in, I believe, the summer of 2019 or 2020 when he revised the constitution and said that Russia was founded by Slavic-speaking people who are the ancestors of Russians, and it will always be their country. That is a kind of revision that could never happen in any Western country.
Absolutely not.
Absolutely not. That would be the cause for a civil war. But
Even
it is possible in Russia.
yes,
And I think Arestovich, maybe he's not thinking of that particular example, but he is generally along those lines, thinking about how you could have more of a federation, as the interviewer says. Um, the other interesting point in this interview is, the whole thing with Bucha, which I thought was another clever narrative shift by Arestovich. Um, I mean, there have been articles, Western articles that not from newspapers that are pro-Russia in any way, that have basically said it was Johnson who convinced Zelensky not to. I mean, it wasn't even a surrender, but agreed to a peace agreement, right? Um, But Arestovich very skillfully here is trying to imply that it was Bucha that was the big turning point, right? Now, I've seen the Frontline episode on this. I've seen counter arguments from Russian sources on Telegram. And, at best, you could say 36 civilians might have been killed exclusively by Russians, right? Like you might say that. Definitely some of them were killed by them. And one reason is there was an area of Bucha that the Russians had a difficult time to control, and part of that was basically the people were giving coordinates to the Ukrainian forces. But there were other times where they just haphazardly shot in the street. Now that could have been frustration. They lose 4 or 5 guys and they're furious, right? But the way the media tried to portray it, which they tried over and over again, later with Mariupol, then with Liman.
As if Russia were the IDF.
Yes, they bombed them to smithereens, hundreds and hundreds in mass graves. But they also took the time to separate them. No mass grave. Each one has a cross. It's just absurd, right?
Getting back just to this general
And
point.
remember that the UN has not said that this was a genocide, um, and that the British forbade anybody else to investigate.
And I
Right?
remember for a time it
That's the
was
link with Johnson.
it.
That is the link with Johnson. And
Yes.
there were the other videos where bodies are being moved around by the Ukrainians, and then the Ukrainians, dragging and killing other Ukrainians who were sympathetic to the Russians who had tied white bands. Right. So I'm just saying the numbers were low on both sides. Unfortunate, but not the hundreds and hundreds and mass graves and that the West tried to portray that it was.
Well, I
So
remember that for a
on some
time it
level,
was.
Arestovich knows this is a lie, but
Well, oh, of course he's playing the narrative shift. But for a time there was about a month and a half after Bucha happened where you could not mention it lest you be
yeah,
banned from whether that be YouTube, whether that
yes,
be Twitter, whether that be any of these social media. And that's how much under wraps that they had the story. That's how much the narrative they wanted to paint
yes,
around that. And also just getting to the general point of that. Frankly, when it comes to these claims about just Russian campaigns of destruction, I mean, you don't need to look any further than Mariupol to see what they've done with the occupied territories, and that is they've completely revitalized these places.
yeah, yeah,
They are fighting a genuine war of conquest where they do want to integrate this territory. They do want this territory to be. They do truly view it as part of the Russian Federation. This isn't just a campaign like what the IDF does in the West Bank, what the IDF does in Gaza, where they just level an area and move their people in and build a kibbutz. And that's, I mean, the difference is night and day. And you could call me a
yes.
Russian, so you can say whatever, but point being is, we've seen time and time again that the Russians truly do believe that this is a war of reunification of lost territory. This is a
Hmm.
war of reconquest.
Mariupol looks better now. The parts that they have rebuilt and revitalized, Mariupol looks better now than in 2014.
And believe
Like,
it or not, all those migrant workers went home afterwards. Who would have thought?
oh no.
Yeah,
um,
Mariupol is not the. It's not full of Indians. It's not full of Central Asians. And I thought this was some sort of a great plot by Khan Putler to
Khan Putler, I
to
love
rebuild the
that.
Mongol Empire. But
What did you think of the point when he said that now a peace process, a treaty is also impossible because he blames Putin for this. But you could say it was baked in the cake right from the start. That now a peace process or negotiations are impossible because the war is no longer about Ukraine, but engulf Yemen, Gaza, Israel, Taiwan. I thought that was pretty interesting.
once again, the only person I've heard anybody who's anybody, any significant figure who's ever made that point. Because once again, this take has been going around these circles for a good year now, at least. And this is the and once again we've brought up on this program several times, but this is the first time I've heard anyone of any sort of significance or influence in at least the political level actually mention anything like this. Now to continue on, because this last section of the article is a bit interesting and it does touch on some things we got in here, just the last leg of this article here. So Sayer continues. So you don't believe that there is a much stronger Ukrainian nationalism now than 2 years ago? Because by report, the fact of the invasion has brought Ukrainian people together. You're saying this has not happened? Arestovich, Ukrainian nationalism is an idea that less than 20% of Ukrainians hold. This is the problem. Sayer responds, what about the remaining 80%? Arestovich says, I think for most of them, their idea of a multinational and polyethnic cultural country. And when Zelensky came into power in 2019, crucial point by the way, they voted for this idea. He did not articulate specifically, but is what he meant when he said, I don't see a difference in Ukrainian and Russian language conflict. We are Ukrainians even if we speak different languages. And you know, that is my greatest criticism of what has happened in Ukraine over the last year. During the emotional trauma of the war, in this idea of Ukrainian nationalism, which divided Ukraine into different people, the Russian speakers and the Ukrainian speakers, with the Russian speakers as a second class people, it is a dangerous idea and a worse danger than Russian military aggression because nobody from the 80% of these people want to die for a system in which they are people of a second class. Say, Sayers responds, you're planning to run for president of Ukraine? How can you run for president if you don't even believe believe it holds together as a country? Arestovich, because I have an idea. I call it the Fifth Project, which could unite the country back. It's a completely specific political program, which is well known in Ukraine. We've had four political projects in Ukraine: Russian, Soviet, nationalist, and Euro integration projects. My project collects the best from all these projects to recreate into a so-called Fifth Project. The main idea of which is to unite Ukrainians, to recognize all Ukrainians in our history, in our modernity, and in our future. Ukrainians, may, whatever the way they may live, whatever language they may speak, whatever they call their culture, tradition, or religion, it looks like the United States of Ukraine.
Oh my gosh.
Uh, what a phrase. Sayers, having heard what you said about the differences in Ukraine and Russian-speaking parts and the West being so different, is this the so-called Kissinger solution, where there's some kind of settlement with Russia and Russia takes certain provinces in some form of peace deal? Does that look attractive? Arestovich, I don't think so. For me, the price of Ukraine to get into NATO was a big war with Russia. As I said in 2019 openly, it was in our media. I think that the price for the West to get Ukraine inside of NATO is a big war with Russia, and the collective West are not ready to pay that price. This is a problem, and for me, it's completely unrealistic for Ukraine to even hope to be part of the European Union or NATO. It's impossible in this real life situation. Sayers, and yet you don't want to be part of Russia. Arestovich, no. I completely and very strongly stand on the position of an independent Ukraine, but this independent Ukraine for me has to go the way of Israel or South Korea. Not part of Russia, in no way will be part of Russia, and if we have to realistic, not part of NATO either. Has to be a naturalized country strong with a deep relationship with the collective West, because we are a European nation historically, but now it's completely unrealistic, not from our side, from the West side. Sayer. So your vision for Ukraine is neither part of Russia nor part of the EU or NATO, and to have a special status as a borderland country that contains many people in it. Arestovich. Yes, and if we're able, and if we're effective,
Borderline country, you don't say.
they should name it after that. um, yes, and if we're effective and clever, we could use it to our great advantage, such as infrastructure, logistical corridors, and a multicultural transformer that could understand both sides, Europe and Russia, and the Asian countries. But we have to be ambitious and get into this role. We could play, I think, a very important role in security, logistics, and stability of Eastern Europe, first of all. And for this, there could be a prospective aid for all Ukrainian foreign policy. But this foreign policy is completely a mirror of internal policy, so we have to change ourselves from inside before we get this type of idea into Europe. Sayer, my final question is, if you do get back to Ukraine, there is an election. If you're allowed to run, do you think there's any chance you'll win? Arestovich, I don't know, but I have to give it a chance to the people who believe in it. Very,
Wow.
very Arestovich ending there. But once
A
again,
lot to unpack.
in terms of the pro-Ukraine side, that's the most coherent thing I've ever heard from any of them.
Hmm. I agree.
And this is coming from the man who, once again, you can go back on the archives of the show, was making some of the most clownish and bombastic statements at the beginning of this war.
Absolutely.
But
He was he was all over the place. All over the place. Um,
we'll crush the toy armies of Europe.
yeah. I remember that of Russia and Ukraine united. Before the end of April, he said, "We're finished. Our military. We're going to have to." Now he was right. We're going to have to depend on the West to to keep this war going. He wasn't wrong about that, but for a lot of Ukrainians, he gave up too quickly. You can see how he's rubbed certain Ukrainians the wrong way, and I mean, all these parties that are invested in a victory in Ukraine, whether it's the Americans or, the rest of the West, the collective West, the essentially the lackeys of the U.S. Um, I mean, for them, it's a sunk ship cost fallacy now. They've invested far too much, and they have to win uh, because their economies are not doing very well. And to be beaten economically by Russia is it's almost unprecedented. Um, but I mean, he has very interesting points. They're very realistic in the assessments, but in the possibility of implementing his vision is near zero.
no, if
Because
I'll
for
say
America, why would you want a Ukraine without Crimea? You could also argue, why would you want a Ukraine that still had significant Russian influence and that would respect Russians? That's that's not possible, right? Estonia, for instance, is creating now a law to begin deporting Estonians of Russian descent who are incapable of speaking sufficiently in Estonia, right? The Baltic countries, I think it's almost a certainty that they're going to, like, especially if the war in Ukraine continues to go badly for the Ukrainians, they're going to try to provocate the Russians. Just like the Ukrainians launching missiles into Poland and then claiming that those missiles were, I mean, if it wasn't an accident, but if it was intentional, and there's just as much reason to believe it was than there is to believe it wasn't. Um, every time Ukraine gets desperate, they will bomb civilians, and then Russian occupied areas of Ukraine or Russian cities, or they will try to get the West to get involved in the war. Right? We see less of that now because, frankly, um, materially speaking, the West simply doesn't have enough arms to engage in the war. You could argue that Putin's strategy of going slow in the war, right? And what that did is it caused Europe to delay the possibility of sending in Polish troops, let's say Polish and Romanian troops, right? Because then they would have had enough firepower to throw the Russians back. If we assume, that we wouldn't have seen nuclear missiles fly, right? Um, or there was some kind of a mechanism that allowed them to send even more mercenaries. I mean, Poland sent in thousands of Poles to fight there. But let's say those numbers were larger, right? Then it would have been possible. But I think basically, and this brings up another point, he talks about Kiev um, and the nature of the negotiations. Like, I remember when Medvedev on his Telegram account was talking roughly, and Peskov especially. Back then, people thought, I initially thought Peskov was being honest, and I didn't like what I was hearing. But a lot of people were also saying, I'm not saying they were the majority, but they were also saying that Peskov's statements that they've reached an agreement, they're going to withdraw from these territories, and people were irate that was the case. But what Arestovich seems to be implying here is not only was that a possibility, right, but that even there would be a time limit, a kind of revisit of the status of Crimea. I mean, a lot of this is also based on. I mean, I think if Putin has any input into this planning of this war, then I would say there were two Putins. The Putin that invaded was a minimalist, and he's not a maximalist now, but he's very different than what he was at the beginning of the war. And the strategy to hold off Ukraine and the West by fighting a slow war of attrition, where the West slowly begin, because if it goes slowly, the West doesn't feel the need to go in. And now, as the time to go in and rescue Ukraine seems to be advancing, they now do not have the armaments necessary in order for this victory. So I'm not saying they won't go in. I'm not saying that if, let's say, if Ukraine doesn't get funding, there's all sorts of articles that are appearing about how um, if that happens, NATO troops will have to go in and secure Western Ukraine. But this interview does open up like a lot of discussion. Um, um, I mean, I have something to say about Germany and Tusk, which is in a bit related in terms of provocations and
Certainly.
the immediate
And
future with regards to what I said about Estonia. But I'm curious, what's your input?
I do just want to say I agree completely about the Baltic states, and frankly, I think that just speaking purely politically, just as a game of brinksmanship, as a game of one upping the other, if the Baltic states really do expel these people, they should all be settled in the new oblasts. They should be
Mm,
settled in the Donbass. They should be settled in
yeah.
Zaporozhia. They should be settled in
Mm,
Kherson, etc.,
interesting.
etc. But that aside, I do think that what we saw here, and I'm not saying that Arestovich is secretly in the pocket of the Russians by no means.
No, no, no.
I do think that he genuinely believes what he's saying. I do think that he represents simultaneously a large cross section of the Ukrainian population, but also a completely politically powerless group of people who have
Yes,
really
yes.
no say in any of that, while
Those
still
aren't the people that America invested in for 70 years.
yes, absolutely. And I would say that once again, all of the points that he makes are completely valid. You've heard them on this show. You've heard them on other programs from other people in these circles who have given any semi-serious analysis of this war, even before this war. But we once again run into the problem. There are no viable solutions from a pro-Ukrainian standpoint because we have a few things to look at here. We can look at the group of people that Arestovich represents, which I would say is probably a slim majority of Ukrainians, but once again, a very politically powerless group. You have the Ukrainian nationalists who completely reject what he says wholesale. Uh, we are the Rus, we are the true Eastern Slavic people, but also we need to decouple ourselves from all these things that are too quote unquote Russian because we can't accept those. We need to just large Germany. Well, you have that faction of people who have quite a bit of political power in Ukraine. And then you have the West who sees no difference in these people, and the more that they destroy each other in this meat grinder, the better. The Ukrainians will be used as the first wave, they'll be used as cannon fodder, so then we can deliver the final blow to the Russians. That's the three primary groups we're
Yeah.
working with here. And once again, those answers, they may satisfy that politically powerless group, but they certainly don't satisfy the much more relevant groups, particularly the West, and that being especially the power center of the American empire, the Washington neoconservatives, and it certainly does not satisfy the Ukrainian nationalists, who are the go-to guys for the neoconservatives for the American empire. And I can see why people call Arestovich pro-Russian because if you look at these situations with any degree of realism, with any degree of how it's realistically going to
Hmm.
turn out, you have to concede that by and large these people are Russian, this land is Russian, and that trying to maintain this Ukrainian state is something of a fantasy. And maybe if post 1991 politics were different, maybe if Ukraine really did establish itself as a middleman nation, as he wanted to talk about, as this go between frankly different civilizations, then we could be working with something here. But the ideas that he's pushing are at least 30 years too late to happen.
Yes. I mean, I think this was a kind of a consensus in Ukraine from the beginning of 91 that was eventually squeezed out. I saw it myself by following the war from, early 2014 and, very late 2013 when the Maidan happened. I mean, that's essentially what we saw.
Oh, need I mention the
Um,
negotiations before the Maidan, the deal that was prepared to be in place where the Ukrainians will join the European Union. They will not join NATO. They will join the Eurasian Economic Union in partnership with Russia, and they
yeah.
will be allowed to be a neutral country that participates in both economic blocs but is militarily neutral. That once again, the sweetheart deal, the best Ukraine could have ever asked for. And then the Maidan started. Pravi
Yeah.
sector, all these different groups took out to the streets. That was an unacceptable deal. And now Ukraine is the poorest nation in Europe with one of the highest immigration rates in the world.
Yes. It really makes, I saw an interesting video by some, I sent him to you, this Russian Jewish guy who was talking about the project of the new heavenly Jerusalem in Ukraine. And, one of the videos is a mayor of Kherson who says, I'm not signing on to this kike project. And the guy,
Wait, is that the same guy who talked about if you oppose the satanization of if you oppose the satanic West, vote for United Russia? Is that the same guy?
no, I think it's a different guy.
Oh, I
I
love
think
that there's
this is
multiple
before.
that you had to like try to figure out which one's which.
Uh, yeah, I think this is a different guy. There is a longer video. I sent you that, but I haven't finished watching the whole thing. It is, I think, at least an hour. Yes, what was his name? I see him here. Okay. This interview was in 2017. Yes, he talks about, Jews in Israel are facing all kinds of challenges and they need a second homeland.
You mean a third?
Third, don't they already have America and England? Um, how many homes do these people need?
As many homes as
uh,
Bernie Sanders has.
so, yeah, Igor Berkut, Igor Berkut. The interview is crazy because he cites a passage from the Apocalypse, from the Book of Revelation, which is actually intended like to represent, the early Christian church finding a place, safe from, persecution. But he reads that as Jews. Like it's so absurd, right? Anyways,
I think they have a word for that. What is it? A chutzpah?
yeah. So, I find it interesting that this guy, is saying all that stuff, but like, where did they fit in? And then you have, in this kind of multi-ethnic Ukraine, right? Um, and then there was another video that I sent you with that American rabbi whose daughter owns a place that literally sells dildos. They're kosher dildos. I kid you not.
Not a more Jewish American family than
You,
that
you
one.
literally, yeah, it's the epitome, right? And he was saying in an interview that Putin is targeting Jews. He's killing Jews. I remembered this when I was a kid in the 70s and 80s. the Russians are targeting Jews. We have to help them.
Putin is the most philo-Semitic anti-Semite in the world.
Yes, yes, yes. So I mean, yeah, all these things that Putin had in mind were like very minimalist. He understood in the best way he could the, let's say, the strength of the Russian culture, the influence that it has, and as long as Russians were not second class citizens in Ukraine, that vis-a-vis them they might be able to play a significant role in Ukraine's development and Ukrainian politics, um, but also not seeing the back door to that. How if Ukraine became very successful, those same Russians could begin influencing Russia in a different direction, right? So I think there is a naivete about Putin, but I would say that when they finally realized that this was going to be a long war and no sweetheart deal, and you can see that the amount of concessions that they were willing to make, right? Um, Kick the can down the road. I mean, they understand. Look, strategically, they understand if they have Crimea, they kind of own the Black Sea, right? There's just only so much that the West can do from there, including, like, let's say, attacking Iran from the Black Sea, right? If Ukraine becomes a total American puppet, um, and Crimea has, I don't know, 3, 4 naval bases, right? Russian presence will sink there. Russian influence will be waning. There would probably even be social calamities within Russia if that were to beginning to happen. A westernization process would certainly begin. Push from minorities in Central Asia and the Far East might be agitated, for color revolutions and stuff. You can see how close America is to having this kind of domination, right? So, Putin's basically saying, look, w- w- except for the Donbass and Crimea, you can have anything that we've already taken, which I understood because I don't think they wanted anything in the north, right?
Oh, of
They
course not.
had between 30 to 40,000 men. Just remember Bakhmut. Bakhmut had over 40,000 men. This is a town of 70,000. Kiev was a city of 3.1 million, right?
Is that Kiev
40,000
City or
at
Kiev
best is,
Metro?
yeah, that is not that is not sufficient to
No.
take over a city. It was just a pressure tactic. That's all basically it was. And it was to draw Ukrainian forces away from the south. I mean, if they didn't, Russia wouldn't have the land bridge. So, anyways, I'm rambling.
I
I'm
mean, I mean,
sorry.
maximally, I think what we can say that the Russians either want or can take from this war is the territory that has historically been known as Novorossiya, and I think that's an at best at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see the evidence of them pushing for more. They make statements once in a while.
I think they
I
want
think
Odessa, but I don't think it's realistic at this point.
no, I don't. I don't think so either. I don't. Yeah, I mean, I like. I mean, we should move on to other news, but like, let's say that America starts getting really involved in Yemen. Suppose that's not going very well, right? And Europe can't deal with, the new stresses, and there isn't enough funding for Ukraine. Although I do think they're going to figure out funding one way or another. Um,
Yeah, if not the seized assets, then something else. They have to have at least a few more tricks up their sleeve. I don't think they're down for the count
yeah,
yet. Now, how Russia will counter those, that remains to be seen. I don't think the Russians are going to be caught off guard by any of these. That
yeah.
all these scenarios, I think, on both sides have been war gamed. But
Yeah, yeah, and I think Putin feels like Russia is sitting in a really pretty place right now, and they don't need to go for maximalist big arrow offensives because economically they're doing very well. I mean, Arestovich is saying stuff that only Russian bloggers were saying in late 2022. You know, After all those successful counteroffensives, and definitely it was obvious that they were press gang tactics in early 2023. That never stopped. It only increased. And then we have articles in the New York Times and other publications calling them body snatchers, right? Um, so he knows that the motivation isn't there for the Ukrainians. A lot of them have fled. You know, at Davos, Zelensky said that no one sits. I mean, these aren't exactly his words, but basically saying no one sits idle in Ukraine. You're either on the front or you're working to help those on the front. If you're in Europe and you're a young man and you're capable of fighting, you should come back. Maybe you'll be, I mean, please, you'll be sent to the front. You're not going to be working in the back. And I mean, that's a good spot. That's a good spot, right? Plus, Putin has his own election coming up. And I mean, we will. Who knows the crazy stuff we're going to start to see in the next 4 weeks? Because a lot of things are going to get ramped up. There are going to be all kinds of operations to they're not going to derail him, but they want to establish like
They
kind
want
of
to
like a
project an image of weakness on Putin going into re-election because they know they
yes,
can't dislodge him via election, but they know that they can decrease his political legitimacy in the run-up and
yes,
during that process. In which
right.
case,
Something that makes him look impotent.
yes, absolutely. And I do think that there are a numbers of vectors of success that they could pull that off, but I do think it is up in the air whether they can or cannot pull that off. I mean, certainly they, like I said, they have tricks up their sleeves. And the Russians certainly have countermeasures to that, and there's countermeasures with countermeasures. These things go back and forth. I'm sure you all know this, but once again, the nonsense they're going to try to pull in just over the course of the next 6 weeks until no, we're looking more like 2 months until the Russian election. You're probably going to see the most ridiculous headlines out of Russia in quite some time, and people are going to eat them up because they always do. They always do, and
Yeah,
whether that be
90% of the
yeah,
population are
whether
NPCs anyway. So
whether that be actually news from inside Russia, news from the front, or if the Ukrainians decide to fire another volley at Bryansk and Volgograd to make the Russian defense infrastructure look weak. What's
yeah.
a myriad of things they can do with all of this. But I don't want to dwell on Ukraine for the entire
Hmm.
show.
Yes, yes, we
And
should
just for
move on.
the last leg of the show, probably the next 45 minutes we're looking at just for the time constraints we're working with, at least on my end.
Hmm.
I do want to cover some Middle Eastern news, particularly Yemen and the flare up
Iran.
in Pakistan and Iran. But I'll start
Hmm.
with Yemen because that is the, I would say, the less recent of the two. I like to try to work my way up these sort of
Hmm.
things. Now, we had the U.S. strikes last week on Houthi targets that were supposedly supposed to dislodge this blockade the Houthis had set up with their rockets aimed on uh, Western and quote unquote pro Israel countries' ships. In which case, they have been blocking Red Sea passages. We've had them go around the Cape of Good Hope, around Africa, which has increased shipping time by a number of weeks at this point. And the main problem is with the shipping lanes, not even that the Houthi missiles are damaging these ships. Now, the Houthis, once again, have been supplied by the Iranians for years. The Iranians have a very capable missile program. So it's not like the Houthis are working with garbage here. It's not like these are the Palestinian bottle rockets from, say, 2014. They're certainly much more advanced than that. But the issue they have run into is liability and who is willing to insure such a high risk prospect. Because when it comes to international shipping, you're not going to ship anything without a very secure insurance package to make sure all bases are covered if anything or everything were to happen to this shipment. It is the basis on which international trade and international shipping rests on. I would say even more so than security guarantees, it is the insurance packages. And once again, like any insurance company, they are more adverse to higher risk prospects. They're not going to throw out these expensive insurance policies that they will have to pay out on if something happens for these ships crossing into dangerous waters. And that is the problem that we've run into in the Red Sea and in the Gulf of Aden. Funny enough, this is the problem that people thought we were going to run into in the Black Sea as the grain deal fell through, but that has yet to happen, that nobody would insure Russian ships. I believe they found some roundabout way to find insurance through non-Western sources. Surprise, surprise. But once again, the Russian ships still continue to flow in and out of the Bosphorus. Who would have thought? But we have, in fact, countries that are not quote unquote pro-Israel, and even the Yemenis, the Houthis, because there's been something of a mutual understanding of the factions that were previously poised against each other in civil war when it comes to the question of Israel, when it comes to the question of this blockade, that they're allowing through Russian and Chinese ships, certainly Iranian ships. And I believe even at this point, with the detente, they're allowing Saudi ships and some Gulf ships through it. Pretty much American and Western ships have been cut off from from the Red Sea, excuse me, and most vitally from the Suez Canal. And once again, the Egyptians have played a very neutral hand on this. They're
Yeah,
trying
yeah.
not to escalate the situation, whether that be with Israel Palestine or whether that be with the Red Sea situation. Because, mind you, Egypt at this point has still refused to open up the border crossing in Gaza because they know the consequence will be a full on Israeli campaign now that there is an escape route, and they'll have to deal with anywhere from 500,000 to 2 million Gazans showing up in the Sinai Peninsula. But that's a topic for a different day here. But they have we have a militant group that has been under siege for the better part of a decade, has closed off one of the most major trade routes. And mind you, I know we've touched on all these points before, but I feel need to repeat them. I feel need to revisit them and to expand on them. We have the Saudi war effort against the Houthis that had been going on from 2015 to 2022, 2023. Mohammed bin Salman, as he reached a thawing of relations with the Iranians, did curtail and eventually more or less halt military operations in Yemen to the point where the Emiratis had pulled out before that, the other Gulf state partners had pulled out before that, and it was gradually showing that the war in Yemen was becoming an unviable project for the Gulf states. But from, let's just say, to be generous, 2015 to 2023, you had an American advised and Saudi conducted campaign against the Houthis that, in order to back the quote unquote official government of Yemen, in order to dislodge this militant group that were backed by the Iranians that were threatening, at that point, particularly Saudi oil fields. They were firing these missiles that the missiles they're now firing at the ships, they spent 8 years firing at Saudi oil fields. Now that there has been, once again, a thawing of relations, the strikes in those oil fields have decreased significantly, and they've turned their attention towards the Israel issue. And not only after 8 years of an American advised campaign with fought with American weapons, Saudi personnel, but once again, we're talking about an American led effort using another nation's manpower, failed to accomplish their goals in Yemen. We go forward to these American strikes after what was a very stagnant period in Yemen, at least when it came to fighting between the two sides of the civil war. And we've seen the Americans directly take on the role the Saudis had been doing for the better part of a decade before that. Once again, to no avail. Striking empty warehouses, striking empty desert. No real damage to the Houthis. And this is a group that's been fighting on and off for decades now, because when you have the partition of Yemen, that roughly falls along the lines of the current borders of the Civil War. But you have these impotent strikes, really, that have accomplished nothing, that have done nothing, wasting manpower, wasting resources, and just hitting empty desert. A coalition, a multinational coalition, the willing, that fell apart in a matter of weeks, even before the operation started. And we're presented with a situation where you have the global guarantor of the seas. Once again, the primary promise of the American empire is to keep the trade routes open and safe, and they're failing to do that even on the most vital trade routes. Not only that, but to prop up Israel's expansion, to prop up Israeli policy. Now, you are starting to see Biden and the White House and the State Department countersignal Netanyahu, countersignal Israel, especially as he said, we think this, especially as Netanyahu says, we think this campaign will go on into 2025. But you do see Washington starting to lean on that, not even from a quote unquote anti Israel position, but realizing that there are greater questions at stake here when it comes to this game between great powers, that your desire to expand into Gaza cannot supersede the American empire, because once again you're relying on us. We go, what are you going to do? But Netanyahu, given the internal political pressure, given the legal pressure on him, is hell bent on accomplishing these goals that he has set out, hell bent on accomplishing these expansionist policies, even at the expense of the American empire. This is the situation Netanyahu's been put in. I think he is on his final blaze of glory, so to speak, where he's just disregarding any of the other concerns and really just trying to cement himself either in Israeli history or trying to buy himself a position where he may be safe from prosecution. I don't really know at this point, but I know that at this point he is acting like a man on his final moves, because I think he can feel the walls closing in on him, both at home and abroad. But that brings us back to, this is coming at the expense of the legitimacy of the American empire. Sure, you can talk about Yemen, you can talk about whether or not the operation should have happened, but the longer this Yemen crisis goes on, the more strikes that are fired that don't dislodge the Houthis, the more American legitimacy decreases once again on its chief promise, on its primary promise, that we are going to keep the trade routes open and safe, that the entire world is going to be guaranteed by the protection of the American Navy. Once you go back to 2007, we wiped the floor with the Somali pirates. We've done that several times. We've dealt with several other crises in international waters. But now that we're faced with probably the biggest crisis in international water in decades, and there is an impotent American response, and it's it's become a complete joke. Nobody can look at this and think that this is the country that is going to direct the global order. This is a country that is going to be a world hegemon when it can't even fulfill its most basic of promises. And I don't know what the solution to this is. Realistically, especially with how entrenched the Houthis are and whether or not this is a campaign in coordination with the Iranians. I'm not saying the Iranians pulled the string of the Houthis, but there is certainly a high level of cooperation there. At what point do you stop this beyond more or less throwing the Israelis and Netanyahu in particular under the bus and trying to return to a status quo? And who says the Houthis will even stop that at this point if they can continue to screw over the American empire in a furtherance of their own political goals? And the only realistic solutions look like either a protracted American campaign in Yemen, which Biden said he does not want to do. Now, I know you can't really take the word of politicians at face value, but especially in an election year, I can't see him wanting to do, especially a boots on the ground campaign in Yemen. That would be disastrous for everyone involved.
It seems to
But
be that implicit in the latest statements from the
I
White
yeah,
House.
I would agree. But once again, it's that's just a disaster in the making, and it, there's really no winning solution when it comes to something like that. Or it is throwing Israel under the bus, which would have massive ramifications, especially considering the size and scope of the Zionist lobby in the United States, the amount of damage they could do to pretty much every elected official in this country. They could completely overhaul the political system overnight, it seems, with the influence that APAC and other affiliate organizations have, on top of the amount of blackmail they have on these people. Once again, they could raise absolute hell with this, and we would be none the wiser to it until it actually happens. But yeah, America is left with a choice: either a another gritty campaign that he promises won't be a 20-year occupation, but we all know will be if it really does come to that, insofar as the U.S. can even sustain another occupation force, or it's throwing Israel under the bus. Maybe not entirely, but at least throwing the Kudniks, throwing Netanyahu under the bus, and forcing some sort of unfavorable political settlement for the Israelis, which, on top of just in terms of international image, America has been so strong in Israel's camp for the past 20, 30 years that is also a blow to legitimacy that this is America's quote unquote greatest ally, and this is how they treat them. And that's combined with the faltering situation in Ukraine and the constant back and forth of will America support this war effort? Will it give up on it? And while I can see one happening and America having to lick its wounds, America cannot simultaneously lose in both Israel and Ukraine without absolute disaster ensuing.
Right. Now, about a week or two ago, I said that two landing ships that would have amphibious vehicles have remained behind after, I don't know if it was the Gerald Ford um, carrier group left, and that I think this was, they have basically a brigade's worth, well, maybe just under a brigade, about 2,000 each, roughly speaking. So a full brigade to maybe perhaps less than a full brigade of Marines. We'll just have to see whether, they go in with some kind of invasion. I think the strategy for the Americans at this point is if we have a war with Yemen, can we bring the UAE and Saudi Arabia, more importantly, on our side? Can we spoil the peace agreement? Can we spoil these two countries that are part of BRICS? You know, that's the juggernaut. Can we do that? Will we force Saudi Arabia to make a decision? And will that decision be to come back into the fold?
Now, I do
Um,
have to say on that note as well, especially when it comes to American manpower and positioning. A question I'll field to you, a question I'll field to the audience. At this point, because it is the least tense of the flashpoints, do you think America is going to not necessarily cede ground in East Asia, but leave itself open in East Asia? Because that really seems like the only solution they can have when it comes to diverting resources. Because they're far too invested in Ukraine to have any sort of pullout. And like I said, they may funnel that through the Europeans. They may take a hands-off approach. They may launder it through third parties. But once again, the support for Ukraine is going to continue until Ukraine collapses as a polity. I think that's what we're really looking at there. And of course, you have this flare up in the Middle East. At this point, I'm not saying that by no means are they going to abandon Taiwan, and I think China has far too much invested in a political solution in Taiwan to make any sort of rash action there. But I could see a potential future where they have to leave themselves very undermanned in East Asia in order to meet the needs of the ongoing crises, particularly in the Middle East. And I do think that if we're going to see any sort of, especially boots on the ground action in Asia, they're going to have to be diverted from places like Japan, places like Korea, and the Philippines, etc., in order to meet those numbers. If we're not talking about activating reserves, a draft crisis, or loads of foreign fighters.
yeah, I mean, it is going to be something it's an unknown now, but it will be a known, I think, in a few weeks, and that will determine, I think, of what happens in East Asia. I agree with you that if they do this, um, I know that the recent Taiwan government that was elected is, of course, anti China integration, but they would leave themselves open. Now, it should also be mentioned that Iran, uh, this past week, fired dozens and dozens of ballistic missiles. In fact, the Americans have evacuated from one of their bases in the village of Hemel, which is west of the city of Kamishli in the Hasaka countryside in Syria, right?
Oh, these strikes took out several key Kurdish figures in both Iraq
Yes,
and
there was
Syria.
that Kurdish businessman that was hit, and then an Iran-backed um Iraqi militant group fired and hit an oil depot in Haifa. The distance was over 1,000 kilometers. The Iranians also took out um, uh, ISIS affiliated groups, Turkmen groups, their upper command in Idlib. I mean, they're bombing them even worse than the Russians were. Of course, they also hit the Baluchistan area of Pakistan, uh, claiming they're a terrorist there. Now, the Pakistanis retaliated by attacking Iran, but what part of Iran did they hit? They hit the Baluchistan part of Iran. So, are they really at war with one another, or are they conveniently finding a way to get rid of the Baluchistanis that are a problem for both countries? Because, I mean, the West funds these people, right?
Yeah, Renaissance
And in
Horizon
order to
actually did an
destabilize both countries.
interesting video on this, or yesterday it was, and he brought up that point that perhaps it is a backdoor deal. I scratch your back, you scratch mine, where it's unpalatable to launch drone and missile strikes in your own borders. So when you do it across the border and both sides can agree to this, it becomes
Hmm.
just a minor international incident that can be smoothed over. And both nations have expressed interest in "quote unquote" normalizing relations after these strikes. And the Baluchistan issue goes back decades now. On the Pakistani side, they are a very much an ethno-nationalist group who want to cleanse the province of any non-Baluchis. In Iran, they resemble much more of a Salafist or Wahhabist group that is much more on the side of Sunni Islamic fundamentalism. Which, once again, you have these cells all across Iran who do these terrorist attacks, like the one we saw a few weeks back, and that's nothing new. But when you can, and like I said, I think it's probably a backdoor deal where they took care of each other's problems in a much more politically
Yeah.
palatable way, both to their own populations and to the world stage. Because while Iran and Pakistan are not on great terms, they're certainly far from allies. Any hostilities that existed between them have decreased by magnitudes in the past several years, especially with this new Chinese led economic bloc that's developing in that part of the world, and with the decrease in tensions in Saudi Arabia, because it's been an open secret for years that the Pakistani nuclear program was a Saudi funded project, and that if Saudi Arabia ever needed nukes, they would be swiftly transferred from Pakistan to Saudi Arabia. That, once again, open
Hmm.
secret for a number of
Yes.
years. Now, one other possibility I think that we do have to consider is, because it is Pakistan, this could just be ISI antics. Now, the ISI, once again, it, we look. There's deep states, there's entrenched bureaucracies, and then there's entirely parallel states. And I would say that the ISI is one of them. They have a completely independent operation within Pakistan, and not only there, but throughout the world. I mean, not that you expect from Pakistan, but it really is one of the world's best intelligence agencies, and they've managed to really cause a lot of chaos all across the world, even independent of the desires of whatever the current Pakistani government might say. So, while I'm not saying this is definitively true, it could just be the possibility that the ISI decided they're going to do their own operation yet again.
Hmm. Yeah. So where does America fit into all of this? Now, last week they also said that they're transferring 1,500 troops in Syria. If it's not a rotation, that would bring the number up to 2,400. If it's a rotation with a few added on, it could be like 15, 1,600. Um, we don't know for sure. But them abandoning one of their bases I mean, it's a serious thing. Like, just to bring both Yemen and the American bases in Iraq and Syria into context, 41 times have the Yemenis hit ships, including British and American ships. Granted, no one has died, but that's 41 just since the second half of November. There were, of course, more attacks than that if you begin counting from like late October or mid-October after October 7th. There have been over 100 attacks since like October 8th or 9th in Syria and Iraq. Like, I mean, this part of the world wants these people out. They want the Americans out. And this is basically what Arestovich has said. They don't want to live under your system. They, they are fighting for their differences. They do not want to integrate with you. And, you know, the success of China, as we've said many times, is because their integration with China is not does not involve the dissolvement of your identity, which cannot be said for the Americans. So, I mean that's their struggle basically. They've seen nothing but war for the last 30 years at least, and you know these countries are devastated, and I mean there's too many to even mention. You know, Libya, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Afghanistan. Um, they haven't been good for the West. They haven't been good for, you know, Western culture and Western civilization, for the stability of European nations. Um, so, you know, if America decides to go into Yemen, you know what? You could give Ukraine a lot of money. You might even steal the frozen Russian assets, and you know the Newsweek article mentioned how stupid that would be. Of course, uh, Zelensky also brought up this idea, or maybe it was one of his ministers, but I think it was Zelensky at Davos, that you can buy bonds. So, you know, those assets are collecting interest, and that would pay for some of the costs. And if Ukraine loses, then they would just take the assets. But imagine, you know, buying those bonds, you know, buying futures on a war. Uh, I it reminds me of that, you know, the Argent video, the live stream that he did. This is some of the most, I can't say the J word. Financial creativity. Um, so, um, you know, I think if America does go into Yemen, it's probably right to suppose that you know influence elsewhere will wane, particularly you know in China, Taiwan. It might even affect the Philippines and Vietnam, but
Well, here's the big
in the Middle
question.
East, I think they're going to go for a gambit. I think they're going to try to reinstate the divisions between Saudi Arabia and Iran by forcing Saudi Arabia to make a decision. But of course, if they do, like, what is left for Ukraine? Like, honestly, like, if Biden commits troops on the ground, and it may not be in the next week or two, but it could be in the next month or two. If that's the case, what on earth will happen with Ukraine? Because the Europeans cannot do it.
Well, I think I thought of a creative solution that's probably been in the Americans' back pocket for a number of years now, but they've never really wanted to go through with. I mean, if the Americans have to reconstitute the Middle Eastern divisions at the expense of force projection in Asia, do you think at that point they finally give the Japanese the green light to repeal Article 9?
Mm,
Because that's the only viable solution I see is they let the Japanese off the leash and let them take over
yeah.
for, or at least take more of the role of force projection against the
They
Chinese.
can do that, but would Japan do it?
Would that is an interesting question. I think that would require a lot of politicking within
Obviously,
Japan.
Australia would have to be dragged in.
Oh, of course. And I do think that with the Pacific
Australia is not
coalition,
ready for
no,
this.
Australia is not, and especially considering at the level of economic interdependence between China and Australia, that it's out
And
of the
India
question
will
at this
not
point.
intervene
No,
either.
no, India is in far too comfortable position, but I mean, I'm not saying it is the solution, but the only card I could see them playing that could even stave this off is trying to goad the Japanese into taking a more aggressive posturing. At which point, once again, the Japanese, despite their poor relations with the Chinese, are still very economically intertwined with them. I mean, we're talking. I think 2019 was a hallmark in terms of Chinese-Japanese trade, where it was higher than ever. Even Shinzo Abe, who was viewed as this like hardline nationalist, was meeting with Xi Jinping and signing trade deals with China. I mean, you can talk about the tensions there, but I do think that while the Japanese are still firmly an American vassal, I don't think there's any denying that. They are very economically integrated with the Chinese. Not to mention all the oil flowing in from the Sakhalin pipeline. That has been the only sanction. Not the only, but the main sanctions that have been waived in this war is that the
Hmm.
Japanese can buy oil through the Sakhalin pipeline, and that's also the question of is the situation in Korea going to escalate? Once again, North Korea has picked up on nuclear tests. They're testing underwater nuclear systems, launch systems, submarine-based missiles. So we're seeing the militarization there continue. We're seeing their continued economic cooperation with both Russia and China. So the Korean Peninsula is far from a solved question. Sure, it's stable now, and I know we talked about around this time last year the possibility of Korea flaring up, and I still do think that is a distinct possibility just because of how many tripwires there are on the peninsula. And I mean, you even have Vietnam starting to renege on its previous position where it was starting to get close to the Americans. Where I think it's about, at least in public opinion polls that have been published, I don't know, it's about a half and half split whether the Vietnamese prefer cooperation with the Americans and the Chinese. And I think that's a figure from about a year or two ago, even at that, where despite the existing ethnic tensions that have existed between the Chinese and the Vietnamese for centuries now, there are plenty of Vietnamese who still do see China as a at least preferable business partner to the Americans, especially at this point. So the American web in East Asia is, I would say, simultaneously the strongest and the weakest, which means if anyone has to give at this point, just because it's the least tense of all the ongoing crises, I think it has to be East Asia. And like I said, that would require them cajoling the Pacific nations into a greater partnership. And as you'd said, Australia certainly isn't ready for that, whether it comes to just raw military preparation or in terms of how interdependent they are with the Chinese. And because, once again, their economies are completely intertwined. When it comes to Japan, once again, Japan also runs into a problem of economic integration where trade with China has increased significantly over the past decade, and their
Hmm.
their military is still capped out. And the question is, are the Japanese people willing to tap into those old feuds in order to repeal Article 9? And then once again, the Korean situation is as much a mess as ever. And I think we all forget sometimes that Russia is indeed also a Pacific power. That they
Yes.
have one of the largest, not one of the largest cities in East Asia, but one of the largest ports in East Asia, in Vladivostok. So there's that right there, and it becomes even more of a mess. And I do think that despite the saber rattling against China in recent years, they've walked themselves in a position where their main focus is still Europe and still the Middle East. In which case, I would strongly make the case that while I don't think they're going to cede East Asia by any means, if they're going to have to pick an area to sacrifice resources and manpower, it's got to be the Asia Pacific region.
Yes, yes. I mean, it's the least tenable. It's the one that the Americans would have the most amount of difficult time.
Which conversely, not that I think that China is this great threat, especially at this point with how just internally ruined America is, but if America had a sane foreign policy run by pragmatic people who didn't despise the nation and its people, you would think that the Asia Pacific would be of the most vital importance.
Yeah,
But
but I mean, as far as the populations in Asia, there was a poll just last year, uh, believe it was conducted between June to September of 2023. So um, the question was, is America's power influence, in their country, a major threat? 53% of Japanese said it was. 23% said it was a minor threat, and 20% said it was not a threat. In Taiwan, 45% said it was a threat, 26% said it was minor, and 22% said it was not a threat. South Korea, 45, 24, 28. Hong Kong, 37, 40, 22. So in each of them, it's either a majority or a minor majority that thinks it is a threat. Uh, I don't see how. I mean, I think they're they're cognizant that it would be a war for America, and maybe one of the things, because as much as this war in Ukraine and now in Gaza and now even in Yemen is dragging on, it's looking more and more like it's something. It's a conflict for America. That's who you're fighting for, and I just think that that a process of reimagining a different world where America isn't the hegemon has already started. That there's these people groups and they do not want to integrate. They don't want to be a some kind of a copy of the U.S., or the U.S. is not something that they strive for.
Absolutely. And once again, touching on Aristovich's point that they are fighting for their right to be different, and
Yes.
it really all does come back to that. But unless you had any last minute things that we had left out or had happened during the show that did not come to my attention, certainly. But
Yes.
otherwise, that's all I had to say.
Well, we started with Kharkov and Arestovich, and we end in that way. Oh, by the way, there was also a Global Hawk American drone that the someone in Iraq shot down. I am impressed by the accuracy of the Iranian ballistic missiles. That really is something. But mourning in the NATO camp and among the Bersaglieri for the untimely death of Lieutenant Colonel Claudio Castilla. Lieutenant Lieutenant Colonel dies mysteriously at 45. It is likely that he was killed in a missile strike in Ukraine. Um, yeah, so a serious warning hit Caranago, the NATO command of the Solibiate, Olona, and all the Versaglieri, in particular those of the Triad section of ANV. In the past few weeks, Lieutenant Colonel, I mean, it goes on and on, but you remember, was it a British general, retired general, or something that like the Russians claimed some generals were killed because they targeted Western Ukraine again.
And then there was the Canadian they captured in Navistal that nobody's heard of since. But
Yeah, the guy
you would
with
have
the
to
rape
wonder, like when it
charges
comes to high-ranking officers, how many high-ranking officers NATO has lost as
has
a result
probably lost that
of.
we don't know of. And who was it? The guy on Twitter, was it Prince of the Taiga? He said
Yeah,
that there's still 130 unaccounted people who died in Yaroviv. Anyways, so another high-ranking officer mysteriously dies. I'm very sure that NATO is working very, very, very closely with Ukraine. Uh, they're doing coordination on the ground. There are people. I mean, there was a HIMARS that was taken out just before Christmas with cluster munitions by the Russians. They're much bigger. They're kind of more powerful munitions than the kind that the Ukrainians are using on loan from the U.S. Um, those HIMARS, like, unless they're all trained now, like any HIMARS that gets destroyed, those are Americans that are dying in them.
oh,
Uh,
absolutely.
which is, I think, why they're so highly prioritized not to get hit, right?
And I would also add on that point, you can tell that NATO does not want this war to escalate for the time being because they are doing the utmost they can to keep these casualties under wraps, that they're not
Hmm.
publicizing this all over the media. Russian strikes American troops in Ukraine because, once again, people would be baying for blood if they saw the casualty numbers that NATO countries were incurring. So they're doing their utmost to keep this quiet, keep this under wraps because, at least for the time being, they're not ready for that kind of escalation.
Yeah, and the only other news I have, um, that Raisi is will be meeting with Erdogan in Turkey. Uh, Putin is going to be going to North Korea soon. The reason the meeting with Raisi didn't take place, of course, is because of the terrorist bombing in Kerman on the fourth year anniversary of the death of the murder of Soleimani. The Israelis did launch attacks both in Lebanon today and in Damascus, Syria. So apparently, five IRGC martyrs in Damascus. These are Iranians who effectively are like conducting operations in Syria, and I believe one Hamas leader, Hamas associated leader in Beirut. Sorry, not Beirut, Tyre, just outside of Beirut, was killed by the Israelis today. But that's all I have.
That's all I had as well, and thank you everyone for tuning in to yet another episode of the War Report. We covered a lot of ground today, especially with that article there. And we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Goodbye and take care.